reduce air pollution, and drive more private financing to the fight against climate change. As nations update their commitments in the lead up to COP30 next year, the urgency of the challenge is only growing, as we can see from the news every day. The more we all work together, the more countries can raise their ambitions, and the faster we can make progress towards achieving them. So let me thank everyone at COP29 who is helping to lead the way forward and keep pushing to move further and faster.
Please welcome to the stage Meg Szabo, Managing Editor of Bloomberg Green and Sustainability Events.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg Green at COP29. We're thrilled to be hosting you here in Baku. The last 2 days here have been really focused on the world leaders, but today the real work starts. Today at this event, we'll be focused on the key issues that will be negotiated over the next 2 weeks and what we're really focused on. But before we get started, a couple of quick announcements. The Wi-Fi info can be found on the back of your badge, but also on the screen behind me. The Wi-Fi name is Bloomberg Green, and the password is Green Summit, capital G, capital S. We would also love to hear from you today. You can engage with us on social media using the hashtag BloombergGreen. And you can also submit your questions to our speakers today using the QR code behind me. Just scan your questions. I'll be sitting right up front, and I will be able to ask those to our panelists. So with that, let's get started. Please join me in welcoming the UK's Special Representative for Climate, Rachel Kite, to the stage for a conversation with Bloomberg's Will Kennedy.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Meg, for the introduction, and thank you, Rachel, for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. What must be a pretty busy couple of weeks for you. Now, obviously, you have a long and storied career in climate finance and climate diplomacy, but you've just started a new role as the UK's special envoy. Tell us what that involves exactly.
Well, just a few weeks into the job, and obviously, we have a government that was elected on a net zero mandate. It campaigned on it. And we have a Prime Minister, Foreign Secretary, that are putting climate and nature at the heart of British foreign policy. So this is an external-facing role, really to try to put some additional political bandwidth behind the way in which the reality of climate change will affect everybody, everywhere, every country, and that by making it a priority, we wanted to shape the way in which Britain reconnects with the world. In particular, I think our relationship with, for the want of a better expression, the global south, right? This is shaped by the reality of climate change and by the reality of nature and how we protect it. And so I will be focused on finance in particular, which is the theme of this COP, and also really fast-forwarding the energy transition, which are ways in which our sort of domestic situation, where we're pursuing our own energy transformation, our own energy transition, relates to the way in which the world will pursue its energy transition. Well, that's an investment and trade opportunity for the UK, but also we have some know-how and some how-to that we can share with other countries as well.
So as you said, this is a finance COP. I think everyone at this early stage realizes that it's this new finance agreement which will make or break this COP. Is that what success for this COP looks like for you, getting a new collective goal on finance? Is that the key?
Yeah, I think the new collective quantified goal, one of the worst acronyms in a business made up of acronyms, the NCQG. So that's at the heart of it. But there are other things which are really important for finance, including progress on Article 6, which is the article of the Paris Agreement that refers to carbon markets. But on the NCQG, this is about the public funds that come from the countries that historically have been recognised within the convention as being where the emissions have been generated, to the countries that are experiencing the worst effects of climate change but didn't historically contribute. Of course, we're at a point in time where, since the convention first came into force and since Paris was agreed 9 years ago, there are many, many other countries that are now growing. Their emissions have grown, so they're now part of the ledger of where the emissions come from. But they're also countries that are also contributing finance in solidarity with others. So, when this was written, when the convention was written in the 1990s, and then when Paris was, we're now in this new world. So the qualified goal has to show where the public money is coming from, but most importantly, in addition, it has to show how that public money is going to leverage private investment. And that will come from many, many different parts of the world and many, many different sectors of the financial sector. And the final thing I think to say about the public money and the private money is that it has to be delivered in ways where countries feel that they own their own plans, right? And then that they're able to mobilize their own domestic capital markets, their own domestic savings, and then have easier access to international investment and easier access to some of the global funds that exist. And what we hear from many emerging markets and developing economies is that the access to the finance, as well as the actual sum of the finance, is important.
I'd like to talk about that more in a minute, actually, because I think it's a really important point. But first of all, how do we solve the China problem? Clearly, as you alluded to, a lot of this public money has come mostly actually from European and other Western, for want of a better word, countries. But since this was negotiated, China, of course, has become a much richer country. It's emerged as the world's biggest emitter. I think a lot of electorates would say, why should we pay in if China's not paying in? Is there a diplomatic solution to that, and what does it look like?
So in climate negotiations, right, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So in the negotiations around the goal, the NCQG, there will be a discussion around the quantum, so how much public money. There will be discussion about layers above or below, however you want to draw it, of different forms of public money, different forms of private investment, different forms of finance. And then there's a question of access, which we will keep over there. And then there's a question of the contributor, what's called the contributor base. Now, there are countries that contribute. China, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, other emerging economies and other economies which now are major emitters, they do contribute. They contribute in different channels and in different ways. Yep. Now, the art of diplomacy is that somewhere in there is language which will be comfortable for everybody. And I think that everybody who's here knows that if we don't get a strong and ambitious agreement on the quantifiable goal, it makes the task of next year really difficult. Next year, everybody has to be coming forward with their nationally determined, their national plan. It has to be ambitious. We have to close the ambition gap between where we are and where we need to be. And for many emerging markets and developing economies, if there isn't a sort of financial package, then they feel they're basically writing plans which are unfunded or will be unfunded. And the Chinese understand that as much as anybody else does.
So you think there is a solution? There is a landing zone there that...
Well, we're on day 3 of the negotiations, so it's way, way, way too early to cast but the UK is here determined to play a positive role in trying to get to a strong agreement.
So let's go back to what you said between the difference between the money and how to use the money, because I think that's a really important conversation to have, and part of your background is at the World Bank, which is distributing money. What does good climate finance look like for developing countries? What are the policies that make the money as useful as possible? I know that's a big question, but
no, it's a great question. It's a great question. So I think you have to think about this in 2 ways. There's climate finance, which is the negotiation under the Paris Agreement around who contributes what, how does it get transferred, who gets to use it, and for what purposes, and how we count it, and even who counts it, right? That's climate finance. Then there's financing the climate crisis, right? And this is where we get into the question of debt sustainability and the fact that for many countries, they don't have the fiscal space and they don't have the resources to be able to invest in their own resilience and their own green growth and investment strategies. And so we have to deal with debt and liquidity stress. We have to deal with their access to large pools of investment capital or concessional finance, which come through the multilateral development banks. And at the beginning of December, the world will arrive in South Korea to negotiate the terms of the International Development Association, IDA, which is the biggest pot of concessional money that developing countries can get their hands on. And so all of these things, and then, of course, the cost of capital, the regulations in place that allow you to use your own domestic savings and capital markets, credit enhancements so that you're investing in your own energy transition, and then the international finance that has to come through different mechanisms, and basically taking the capital that is stored in the world in different places, from sovereign funds to our own savings, and finding ways to have it, and especially move into emerging markets, developing economies, where the infrastructure and the green growth has to take place. And I think that since Paris and then since Glasgow in COP26 in whenever that was, 2021, there's been a lot of talk about mobilizing private finance, and it's starting to happen, but most of that is still not going to the emerging markets in the way that it needs to. And so, for example, we as the UK have helped the Climate Investment Funds, which is a fund that was established before Paris, which the MDBs in particular can access. And we've helped them look at their portfolio and issue bonds on the base of that portfolio and list that in the London Stock Exchange. So suddenly you take a fund of public money, hundreds of millions or billions of dollars of public money from Europe and across the world, and Japan, etc., and you take it to the London Stock Exchange and you immediately raise $7.5 billion. And we can do that again and again. So I think we're getting smarter about how to do that, and that's going to be the solution. But I think one of the problems we hear is that for developing countries in these negotiations, I mean, they're not necessarily Ministry of Finance officials, right? And there is a sort of extraordinary array of acronyms and mechanisms and funds, and it becomes a little overwhelming. And being able to access that and know that financing is there, and then deal with your own domestic regulatory improvements that would help finance flow. So this is a sort of multifaceted problem that involves a total government approach, a whole of government approach. And here we're dealing with climate finance, but around this negotiation is the need to build a bigger, better, bolder and fairer international financial architecture.
So it's really about making the most of that public capital to unlock, find the mechanism to unlock as much private capital as possible.
Yeah, this is not a story of development and aid.
Yeah.
This is a story of supporting countries' own trade, investment and prosperity plans, and that's going to require highly concessional finance, development aid. That's not unimportant. That has to be, and that has to flow especially to the most vulnerable and those for which the other forms of finance don't flow. But then it's mobilizing our own public, using our own public dollars to leverage into more private investment. And then it's laying the groundwork, the regulatory and financial rules in a country so that its own domestic savings are going into its own future.
If I'm a developing country who has enormous needs for finance, both for mitigation and adaptation, might I say this is an easy answer for countries like the UK to give, and actually what I need is just for these countries, to be more generous? Is this talk about more loans? It might seem a bit easy if I'm a developing country.
So I think that our Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, spoke yesterday about the fairness that we know needs to be built into the system that isn't there at the moment. And if you talk to colleagues from the Caribbean, there's more finance leaving the Caribbean in debt service than there is aid and other forms of climate finance moving in. So, we're giving with one hand and we're taking away with the other. So, Mia Motley from Barbados has talked about the Bridgetown Agenda. This is basically, the need to invest in countries and allow them to access the international financial architecture and markets so that they can invest in their own resilience before the storm hits rather than coming in with aid money or with insurance after the storm hits. And so that fairness is something that this government, this UK government, is committed to sort of pursuing now, and is an important part of our conversation. So yes, the system is unfair. It's not fit for purpose, and that's been recognised within the G20 for the last 3 years or more. So it was recognised even by the last government. So it's not fit for purpose. Got to make it fit for purpose. But here in COP29, we've got to commit to a big public finance number that can be leveraged for private finance, and then make sure it's accessible to countries.
Now, I've managed to go 14 minutes without mentioning a certain US politician,
But
which I think is a pretty good number. But clearly we're about to enter 4 years where the US is not going to be engaged as much as the world needs it to be, is going to retreat in many respects, one imagines. How big a problem is it for the agenda that you're trying to pursue that we're going to lose that American role, that American leadership?
Well, I think that the climate crisis is the climate crisis. We're running out of time. I just went to the launch of the carbon budget project, and we're running out of carbon budget, and we haven't peaked emissions. And there isn't a good news story coming out of science at the moment. That does not change, right? What also doesn't change is that the energy transition is underway. What also doesn't change is that even in the United States, the programs that were initiated by the Biden administration are just really gaining ground now, right? And they're going to start being felt by people in all of the states, red or blue now. So that's not going to slow down, because there's only one way that this goes, right? Which is we need clean air, we need clean water, we need reliable energy, we need affordable energy, and that's going to come from an increasing mix of clean energy systems. So that doesn't change, and everybody else will just keep going. And I think that the last time there was a wobble from the United States, the argument was really about you want to be leading this transition, because then you'll benefit by being competitive. You'll get the better jobs, you get the better investments. You'll be able to be in a stronger position through transition, and that's the position of the British government, which is we want to lead. We want to lead because we want this to be of an extraordinary benefit to British people, right, and to British industry, and to British innovation, and British universities, etc. So for us, and I think for everybody else here, there's only one direction of travel. We're all, on the bus, and if somebody steps off the bus, they'll step back on again at some point, because there is only one direction of travel.
And COPs keep going, and
COPs keep going.
And we've got 10 days left of COP29, but let's finish by talking a little bit about, I think many people saw this as an important way station onto to Brazil's COP, which is, because of the NDCs and the need for increasing ambition, clearly going to be an important one. And you've spoken well about how the finance agenda here can unlock more ambitious NDCs next year. But I want to talk a little bit about another thing that will be agreed here, it looks like, which is Article 6.
Yeah.
So in Brazil, I think Brazil is going to lead an agenda about how to make keeping the forest pay. Can carbon markets, the Article 6 market, does that have a role to play there, do you think, to unlock flow of capital?
Yeah, I think so, because this is a conundrum for economists, but has now moved to the centre of the political stage, which is we must invest in the carbon sinks that we find in particular in the tropical forests of Brazil, Democratic Republic of Congo, Indonesia, and other places, Guyana. And if those forests aren't protected, and the people that live in those forests allowed to or supported to live sustainable lives, then we will absolutely fail in our effort to budget carbon, because one thing is to stop fossil fuel emissions, the other is to make sure that those sinks are there. So I think for the Brazilians, putting a focus on nature, but finding ways at scale to finally see resources flowing into the protection of nature before, while it's standing, not just exploiting it once it's been felled, is critical. And obviously Brazil has been a leader in this for many, many years. Brazil, is a big power regionally and globally. We'll be going down to the G20 at the beginning of next week, where Brazilian leadership, they've come out with a strong NDC. We've come out with a strong NDC. The Secretary General will be calling for other G20 countries to come out with strong NDCs. And then imagine that we can get the NDCs closer to where they need to be on the ambition curve, and that we come out with an at-scale sort of system or ability to be able to invest in nature, which carbon markets will be one part. Now, those carbon markets have to be of integrity. We have to fix all of the problems that we've seen in decades of carbon market experimentation under different regimes. But there's no way that we get to success without, as the Secretary General would say, ending our war with nature and finding a way to invest in nature and the people who depend upon it in a way that makes sense for everybody.
Good. We've got 1 minute left, so we're almost done. I think it's hard at the moment for people to be optimistic. I think the political scene is tough. You've talked about the ambition, the gap between ambition and action, and how it's widening, and we're running out of carbon budget. What keeps you optimistic? What are the grounds that you have today here in Baku to be optimistic about where we go from here? Very briefly.
So I believe that hope is stronger than fear. And my hope is in the students that I'm still in touch with, who then you see them graduate and then you see them turning up in all kinds of different roles here. My hope is that as leaders we can be disciplined and focused, and as leaders we can let business do what business does well by setting guardrails and setting clarity about what we expect to happen, and that we can have an engagement with our publics where we are honest about what we face, honest about how we can face it together, and that this is a transition that we can manage our way through, and that young people will lead us through that.
Rachel, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. Good luck for the rest of the COP. I hope it ends as well as you hope. Please join me in thanking Rachel Kite for a very stimulating opening discussion.
Thank you, Rob.
Pleasure. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
Please welcome to the stage Andre Abadi, Managing Director of the Center for Carbon Transition at JP Morgan, Marisa Drew, Chief Sustainability Officer at Standard Chartered, and Karen Fang, Managing Director and Global Head of Sustainable Finance at Bank of America, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Natasha White.
Hello, everybody. So we're here at the Finance COP, and curiously, for a gathering of governments, the credibility of almost all proposals on the table for the new climate finance goal depend on private finance. That's either by you being mobilized, so deals being de-risked by public or multilateral funds, or a loan in order to fulfill this broader investment goal, the sort of second part of the onion that's on the table. But it's no given that private finance can or will step up. We've had a year of strong headwinds against sustainable investing, which has been topped off by the election of a new American president who's not supportive of the climate or multilateral agenda. So we're going to delve into all of this and what it means for boosting private finance to combat and adapt to climate change. If there's time, I'd like to do a Q&A at the end. So if you've got any questions as we speak, please submit them via the QR code that should be up on the screen, and it isn't, but hopefully will be soon. So the new climate finance target under negotiation here at COP29, estimates put the needs for developing countries in the trillions of dollars. And as I mentioned, the success of all options on the table depend on private finance. And that's been kind of framed here, or high on the topic, as blended finance. But this is still so small, and it's nowhere near meeting the needs. Marisa, Standard Chartered's got a big footprint across emerging markets. What do you see as needing to change to greater facilitate blended finance to achieve these ends?
Sure. So where capital hasn't flown in scale yet, although we are growing, so we've hit over $1 billion by your own research that just recently came out about just renewables investing anyway alone in emerging markets has hit now over $100 billion for the first time. But that is only 17% of overall climate finance. So what do we need? Where you see it moving the fastest, and I used a statistic again from your own research, which is sort of more than 400 times more finance will flow if you have good policies. That's the starting point, which is exactly why we're here. If private capital and finance can come together with a very directed ask about, say, refreshing NDCs, where these NDCs are very clear, they're very granular, they can speak to us about where the holes are, then we can respond. And one of the beauties of blended finance is, blended finance in some respects is responding to gaps in the market. So it's when private capital providers who are commercial actors say, I need to bring in some other form of capital to buy down the cost, because that's one of the biggest issues that we have in the emerging markets is affordability, then you're starting to bring it all together. So that's really what we need, and that's what we're here to try to negotiate. So I am hopeful because the scaling potential is massive in our markets, and it's bifurcated in some respects between, we say the global south, which is painting a very big part of the world with one brush, but when we see what's going on in middle income, high growth economies, the scaling is absolutely there. Take in India, for instance. I just have recently gotten back, and I was honestly somewhat shocked, even though intellectually I knew it was going on, to see just how quickly the proliferation of solar, by virtue of a policy from Minister Modi that said in very short order you're not going to be able to import solar components, so you're going to have to figure out how to make them. And all of a sudden, what happened? At the same time, we need the energy mix to completely change in our country. Boom. The capacity is there, the build is there, the scaling is there.
Yeah. Okay, so that's kind of the on-ramp to blended finance, but the use of public funds to de-risk private investment is also meant to have an off-ramp, right? Like it's meant to be a means to an end rather than an end in itself. So, Karen, are you seeing that happening? Are there examples of where blended finance is transitioning into private finance being able to invest on its own 2 feet in these markets? And if so, could you share some examples of where you've seen that take place?
Sure. I do think the off-ramp should be in the calculation and should be the goal. And when we, talking about India, when we actually went in to finance commercial industrial solar 6-7 years ago, and that was really sort of taking over from World Bank and IFC and National Reserve Bank of India. So there was a lot of policy, and they were publicly blending it with MDBs, multilateral development banks and development finance institutions. Once the scale has been reached, they were calling up, private sector banks, and we were one of them to actually go in and take over completely the financing. So that's actually working with a very large PE infrastructure portfolio company, and that's sort of the playbook we follow, right? We have to follow very, very successful portfolio companies taking over from traditional public finance or public MDB DFI blended finance into more private sector. So we've actually done that. We've done that in other geographies as well. I don't think it's happening as much as we all want to see, largely because I do think some of the risk factors are not all de-risked, right? Insurance sector has to come in and play a role because it's not just really government with technical assistance, with enabling policies, MDBs, maybe side by side, maybe de-risking. You really have to think about currency risk, you have to think about political risk, you have to think about technology risk. Although a lot of the deals we're seeing is in mature technologies, green hydrogen and e-fuels, and these things could be very helpful for emerging markets. We have to see that green premium coming down. And I think the insurance sector has a role to play. And so we do need more of these off-ramp preparation work being done across the board. But I am hopeful that will happen more and more.
Okay, and the point on the insurance sector, you mean they're the private insurance sector, you're not talking about public?
Exactly.
Risk. Yeah, okay.
But we're also working on some transactions where we've explicitly said credit support insurance. So how do we de-risk? And we've brought in the MDBs and other players. So it can be private, it can be public, but solving for very specific issues that are the unlocks for us to bring these deals together. And can I also point to one other thing that we definitely need to factor in when we're talking about very large scale, particularly holistic decarbonization scenarios? Often we find that you might have a project, you might have the financing lined up, but the actual capacity in country, particularly in the emerging markets, fundamentally just isn't there. You know, it's people who literally are giving you the permits. You might have deals lined up, and that's your bottleneck. So everywhere it's a little bit different, so we've got to be quite deliberate about what we're solving for.
Yeah, okay. And I want to turn back now to the kind of macro context, we could call it. So we've just seen the election of Donald Trump as the new American president. Andre, JP Morgan's obviously a very big American bank. How are you looking at the elections in terms of what this means for climate finance, both within the US and overseas?
All right, easy question. Look, I think we're all just waiting to see. You know, there's clearly actions that can be taken from executive orders, but I think if you actually look at a lot of where the investments from the Inflation Reduction Act have occurred, it is in some of the red states. So I think it's likely to be a mixed bag. You know, whether or not it's, I think one of my colleagues earlier said, is it a sledgehammer or a scalpel? I'm not sure which one is going to be at this stage, but certainly we've seen significant enough growth in certain areas, and certainly would like to see that continue. I think there will be some casualties. We know there's been question marks about the Republicans' appetite for government to make EV mandates. But then you look at Elon Musk being so close to the president, you wonder, is there a narrative there that might actually benefit EVs? So I think there's a broader question to be asked. I think if you look internationally, though, certainly our expectation is if we just look at the progress we've made against the targets that we've set from a net zero perspective, we've already seen fairly significant progress. We're about halfway through to our 2030 targets. It has occurred in the sectors we anticipated. The power sector and EVs, we thought initially were always going to be the easier sectors to see transition occurring. Think about renewables, think about battery EVs. Clearly there are some headwinds now. Some of the government mandates around EVs, certainly data centers in the US, although I'm glass half full on data centers because of the fact that it's the big tech companies with deep pockets who are the ones who have the demand, and they may actually invest in some of the solutions. So I think we're cautiously optimistic that actually this is not going to significantly derail the direction of travel. But time will tell. Certainly from a JP Morgan perspective, we are looking to deploy capital. We're advising a lot of clients. We're seeing appetite amongst clients to continue to transition. And fundamentally, if the economics make sense, then I think transition will occur.
Yeah. And this is the kind of question for both JP Morgan and Bank of America on the tax equity market. So this is using tax credits to invest in renewable energy infrastructure within the US. And I think it's around $20 billion. It's been a big market for both of you. Massively streamlined under the Inflation Reduction Act. Is that a market that you're concerned about in terms of under the new government getting money to renewable energy and the investability in particular for banks?
I think JP Morgan and Bank of America are for sure the top players in the tax equity market. And I think Inflation Reduction Act introduced 2 years ago, what it really kind of brought to the market is this transferability and direct pay. So in a way, sort of reduced our, let's say, market share, if you will. But that's a good thing because you have many Fortune 500 and other taxable tax-paying companies able to participate in the investment in the energy transition. And we both have done a lot in terms of sharing our know-how, sharing our diligence, sharing our investment expertise and track record with many corporates in the US, in the consumer product sector, in the technology sector, in defense sector, energy sector, to actually use their tax capacity to invest in the tax credit market. So tax equity has gone into more of a, transferable tax credit structuring market. There's direct pay as well. I mean, we're hopeful those will stay because you can't rely on a small group of banks and investors to carry the trillions of dollars needed, right, the burden to transition our economy. Whether you do that for commercial reasons or do that for climate reasons, it's good business. Good business is good business. So hopefully transferability will stay. As Andre alluded to, I think the credits so far, in the $500 billion investments that we saw, a lot are in Republican states. Pretty balanced, but more in the Republican states, and we see Congress kind of taking that up very favorably. Hopefully transferability, again, just introduces more investment dollars, not on taxpayer dollars, right? But kind of from corporates and others into the equation. So hopefully that will stay as well.
Yeah, okay. Would you like to add?
No, agreed.
On the last question on this topic, the overseas investment picture. So the US is a major shareholder in all of the big multilateral development banks, not just the World Bank, I was surprised to learn, but also the Asian Development Bank and others. And again, Trump has been kind of not so favorable towards the multilateral agenda. And what, in your view, does this mean in terms of the outlook for blended finance, in terms of getting money where it's needed to combat climate change?
Well, I mean, I'll take a stab. I think it's not just the multilaterals. I think you've got to look more broadly. We've certainly seen some of the projects in Europe that transition-related that have succeeded have had a variety of funding from the EU amongst other areas. So I think insurance is going to play a key role. Export credit agencies are going to have a role to play in this as well. Again, I'm interested in Marisa's view on this, because ultimately, where a lot of the benefits could be, if you start looking at the multilaterals, is in the emerging market developed economies, who would like to see the multilaterals still play a significant enough role. So again, I'm not sure that you're going to see a significant scaling back or paring back of this. It feels to me like, depending on the sector, the geography, again, as long as the economics are making sense and there's momentum, as we're seeing in India in the solar sector, I think that's irreversible.
I would agree with that. And also, let's also remember that concessionary capital isn't only provided by multilateral development institutions. What we're starting to see, and there's a big presence here at COP, is the philanthropic sector. Pools of philanthropic capital coming together in a very directed way, saying, I want to be part of the energy transition. If catalytic capital is a feature that is needed in a particular structure, we're there. So that's pretty exciting development. The other thing I would say is that the level of engagement that we have from countries who are shareholders of these multilateral banks outside of the US is enormous. And a lot of this is in some respects self-interested. So if you're thinking about a developing market country who's a shareholder in an MDB, the net benefit is to their own country if they're participating. So I'm actually a big believer that if anybody starts to wobble, there's going to be plenty of capital that is there to try to fill in the gap, particularly in the EM world.
Okay.
If I may just add one thing, and I think challenges are always opportunities, right? When you think about, what we just talked about, again, insurance sector has a role to play, and clearly development finance institutions, a lot of governments are putting their DFIs on steroids. And you think about that. You think about the fact that clearly United States will remain as one of the largest foreign aid providers to the rest of the world. And you think about how you can use that funds, or potentially thinking about restructuring some of those partnership, right? And given the geopolitical interests, given the energy security, energy affordability, energy transition agenda, maybe if transition isn't as high on the agenda, energy security and geopolitical interests are still very high on the agenda. So I do think partnerships are going to remain. I do think there are clever ways and perhaps more efficient ways of using foreign aid and other partnership dollars. DFIs, DFC has done a great job in the United States, and that mandate hopefully will stay. So I do think, value chain, supply chain, build up and security is a priority. And I do think we can actually, from the investment sector and financial services sector, our job is really to connect the dots and make sure money and capital goes where it needs to.
Yeah, okay. And I want to turn now to transition finance. So coal, the world's most polluting energy source, and yet still powers over a third of global electricity. Banks have been reticent, I think it's fair to say, across the board to get involved in the financing of the early phase out of coal power plants, linked, for example, to their climate policies and also, I think, regulatory sentiment. But both Bank of America and Standard Chartered have pitched to finance the shattering of a coal plant in Indonesia, Cirebon, and that deal was due to close in June, but we haven't heard a huge amount about it since. So I don't know, Marisa, perhaps you could tell me what's holding it up, and is there still a role to play for banks in financing, in the financing structure of these deals?
So whilst I can't comment on an ongoing transaction, and I can talk in the conceptual, for sure we have appetite to participate in early coal decommissioning. It's critical in our markets particularly. You know, our home is Asia, Africa, Middle East, and these are, in many cases, they're coal-dependent economies. And the only way we're going to get to our own net zero targets is if we help our countries and our clients in those countries transition. We went so far, and there was a lot of engagement, I have to tell you, with our external stakeholders to change. We have what we call position statements, and those govern what we will and won't do. And one of our position statements is no coal financing. However, all of this is nuanced. And when coal decommissioning opportunities came to the table, and we were having this conversation with the NGOs, who are generally the ones saying, you know, we don't want you to be financing heavy industry or high carbon emitting industries. The way we had the conversation was, we want the same thing. And the only way, particularly in these markets where the coal plants are quite young in their life cycle, is if we decommission early, and isn't that a good thing for the world? And we got tremendous support, and we adjusted our position statement only for that very specific use case, and that set us on the path to start engaging in financing. And a lot of this isn't commercial at the traditional rates, and so these types of structures are the perfect examples of a blended finance opportunity. And let me touch on one more thing in terms of financial creativity, where we're bringing new models of finance and new ways of thinking to the table, and something as complicated as coal decommissioning is the carbon credits world. So with some very interesting engagement, particularly in Asia with Asian governments, and I give a lot of credit to the Singapore government, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, who's been really promoting this idea of creating a coal decommissioning carbon credit. This is not high tech. You don't have to worry about the integrity of the project, because you know very clearly if you shut down a plant what emissions you save. The math is quite simple. The concept of creating a credit around that and being able to sell that credit to help pay for that decommissioning, really interesting idea.
Yeah, okay. And Andre, JP Morgan, what is your appetite in this space? And I think we talked briefly about the UK Transition Finance Market Review that's just been undertaken. It's an example of recommendations to regulators about how they could possibly change to facilitate this. How are you looking at that, and what's your kind of appetite in this space?
I think similar with my colleagues. In fact, one of my colleagues in our risk team in the audience actually did exactly what Senator Schwartz has done, and helped us change our own policy framework to allow for some of these coal phase-out projects. I think there's also, it's interesting because, you know, there's the framing of it is the financed emissions, and I think, you know, our view on financed emissions is different from a few other institutions. We take an approach which is more about the intensity of our clients' operations versus absolute. And the problem when you start counting absolute is the issue you're asking the question about, which is the consequences if you take exposure to this asset is going to increase the emissions that you're financing. And I think we need to move away from that. I mean, I think we need to understand the fact that these assets do need to be decommissioned. We're also looking at projects similar to Cirebon, and you know, we certainly have the appetite. And I think to Marisa's point, the interesting thing about Cirebon is, again, you do have a multilateral angle to it. You do have concessionary, you know, lower interest rate lending going into it, again, which is the way in which these projects are going to have to be done going forward.
Yeah, okay. We've got a few minutes left. I just wanted to see if there were any questions from the audience. There are.
I have quite a few, so I'll see if I can get through a couple of them. I'll start with the coal. Regarding the coal phase-out credit, what is the money used for? Replacing the capacity, or happens if the financing gathered is not sufficient? Replacing capacity, or if the financing gathered is not sufficient.
Okay, I think that's one for Marisa.
Well, certainly some of the early ones we're working on is actually to pay the owners to shut the plant down early, because many of these plants are privately owned. And somebody's got to pay to close them, because somebody paid to put them in place in the first instance. So that's sort of the first generation of these. They aren't state-owned businesses, so there is a private actor involved, and that private actor needs to be incented to shut down early. There's no other mechanism, otherwise it would keep going.
Yeah, I agree with Marisa. I think it's really for foregone future revenue of the plan, right? But I do think there are the second generation, if you will be actually for investing in replacement.
Yes.
And power generation, whether it's renewables, whether it's looking at geothermal, whether it's looking at hydrogen.
Will mandatory corporate transition plan disclosure help transition finance to flow?
Andre?
Short answer, I don't think so. I think, when we went into the transition finance market review, I think the view was what we need is transition plans, we need taxonomies, we need labels, and then transition capital will start flowing. And I think all of those are useful tools. It certainly would benefit us as a bank to have our clients disclosing their transition plans. But unless our clients actually have economically viable assets to invest in, capital is not going to flow. So I think we need to understand that mandatory transition plans, fine, may be good from a disclosure perspective. They're not necessarily going to unlock the capital that you need. I think a lot of what we've been discussing on this panel, government regulation, policy frameworks, blended capital, concessionary capital, that's what you need in order to allow some of the capital to flow into some of these solutions.
I can just comment, having just literally signed off on our 50-page transition plan document, which we're about to disclose as part of our annual review next year, that the document is helpful in the sense that it forces your institution, we're a very large, complex institution, to put into one place what is our plan. How are we executing it? How are we operationalizing it? So interestingly enough, the engagement to produce such a report was actually quite helpful for my own stakeholders inside my bank. And then I do think that some degree of transparency with our clients about how we're thinking about it and how we're approaching the transition is helpful. But I 100% agree with Andre in the sense that, is that going to be the be-all, end-all for the capital flow? No, it's getting into these projects, as the three of us do, rolling up our sleeves and trying to figure out how do we solve for those missing gaps we started at the outset of the panel.
Okay, I think we've probably got time for one.
One more? Okay. How do you see commercial banks' role in the buildup of industry awareness, capacity and capability? To your earlier point, Marisa, that this many times is lacking in emerging countries to enable blended financing deals to happen?
I think a lot of it is actually sharing the know-how, the expertise, right? All of us have gone into different partnerships, whether it's the JEP that we were part of, whether it's the B20, for Brazil's G20 this year, we were heavily involved in sharing know-how, with the United Nations. Again, a lot of us are involved in the United Nations Global Investors for Sustainable Development, SMI. So through these task forces, we're really sharing templates, right? How do you get a deal done? What is de-risking? How do you actually get some of these, blended deals done and start looking at carbon credit deals, right? Project finance templates, warehouse facility, drawdown facility. These are things that are very common in OECD countries, and they're not emerging markets. So one is sharing expertise, sharing the financing templates, education, right, with governments and also private sectors within the geographies. Two is really around kind of demand signal, right? Us ourselves being actually kind of getting governments and getting other off-takers into the country, multinationals, to start actually facilitating transactions from a preparation standpoint, and so on and so forth. So a lot of things we could do.
Can I just add one quick one? Just a shout out for your audience. There's something called CASI, C-A-S-I, which was championed by Dr. Ma Zheng, who's a UN climate champion. The whole idea behind this was, as absolutely Karen said, is to share best practice and knowledge. So this is a resource that was designed to take the best of the best, no matter what education or subsegment of climate is out there, and put it into one place and make it available, particularly for the developing market. So if you are a young policymaker or you are a young person who's actually going to have to sign off on these permits, you can dip into this knowledge, this wealth of knowledge, and get yourself really up to speed on what those issues are that you need to do your job. So it's sort of a real capacity building initiative that's global in nature, and the system is contributing to this. It's quite exciting.
Great. Well, on that note, thanks very much, everybody. And I think, we need to wrap up there. So thank you very much to the panelists.
Thank you.
All right, thank you to that amazing session. So next up, we are going to hear from some of our amazing Bloomberg Green and Bloomberg journalists that are here on the ground at COP. what they're watching, what they're paying attention to, and they'll also be taking your questions again. So we'll continue to put the QR code up so you can submit any questions that you have throughout this session. So we're almost ready. Just giving them one more second to set the stage. So please join me in welcoming our next speakers to the stage. We have Bloomberg's John Anger, Jennifer A. Delohi, Akshat Ratti, Natasha White will be back with us, and Aaron Rutkoff.
Hello, everybody. I'm Aaron Rutkoff. I'm the editor of Bloomberg Green. I know we're going to have a conversation up here, and then at the end, we're going to leave time for your questions. So please do use the submission form if you have anything you'd like to ask our reporters. I mean, my first question is, who's covering the COP, since we have the entire reporting team of Bloomberg up here? So look, I'm sure we're going to have a lot to say about political developments in the US that preceded our arrival here, but I want to put a pin in Trump stuff for a moment and focus on what we've actually been able to see from the first 3 days here in Baku. We've been through a lot of leader speeches, and I think everyone agrees this is a crucial, very important issue that defines our time. But what are we actually seeing in terms of progress on the big deliverable goals that we're all following here at COP? John, Akshat, what have you been seeing so
Sure.
far?
Yeah. Well, as you've been hearing throughout the day, the main issue that needs to be solved is this new collective quantified goal on finance. Developing countries want that to be in the trillions, with at least hundreds of billions coming from developed countries' public coffers. So that's really the centerpiece of what we're looking here today. And we know already that, one veteran climate negotiator put it to me that this will be the most difficult COP since Paris, because it's about money, and no one likes talking about money, especially rich countries. And so for the first few days, we've kind of been battling out over the agenda. Developed countries kind of want some sort of trade-off here to make sure that the achievements unlocked at last year's COP to do with transitioning away from fossil fuels, scaling up renewables, boosting energy efficiency, still have a place at this year's COP. So that's what we saw on the first day, on Monday, was this agenda fight over where to agree that language. And then, we had the world leaders, not many from the highest emitters, only 2 from the G7, that being Italy and the UK. And that's kind of taken up much of our time, and it will be from tomorrow onwards that we get into the real nitty-gritty of negotiations.
And the money is not just important because tackling climate change requires a lot of money, but because these countries have to come next year and come up with new climate pledges under the Paris Agreement that will take their targets out from 2030 to 2035. And if they don't have commitments for money, they'll be likely less ambitious, and we'll see more climate change.
So the money sort of precedes the possibilities of what goals you might define for yourself as a nation, especially for developing countries. Is that right?
Yeah, because a lot of these NDCs, as they're called, nationally determined contributions, they can be sometimes conditional and unconditional. So unconditional being, we will do it regardless of what happens. But if you give us money for these things, we'll do more. And so the more can be really more if they have the guarantees, at least, of some amount of money coming their way.
So we're obviously on the record here, and I don't want you guys to break any confidentiality in your reporting, but in terms of what we can see in the nitty-gritty, in terms of documents or the actual language that's fought over, how does it feel like the starting point or the first few days is compared to past COPs?
There has been a suggestion that perhaps there be 2 numbers coming from this NCQG, which could be, one, recognizing what the need of developing countries is, which, as John said, could be in the trillions, but the commitment coming from developed countries is in the hundreds of billions. So current commitment is 100 billion, and maybe you go up to 300 billion, maybe you go up to 400 billion. And that is perhaps one place where there might be some agreement, but it is a long road ahead. We've got another 10 days of negotiations.
Okay, so let's keep talking about sort of comparative COP experiences. On stage here is a lot of COP weeks or years. It probably feels like lifetime spent at COP. How does this one compare to your more recent experiences at COP? Jen, what's the vibe been like for you?
You know, it's such a different COP. This is my fourth one. There's actually a surprising amount of walking from space to space and a surprisingly low amount of sunlight once you're in the facility. You know, the mood also, I fully expected coming here after I'm coming from Washington, D.C., I fully expected, you know, Trump to be kind of hanging over everything, the election to be hanging over everything. And I guess the surprise a little bit to me is that that's not happening as much as we progress through the COP. It's like we've gotten the conversations out of the way the first few days, now we can move on. But to me, this COP feels more sedate in some ways because it is focused on this harder, nitty-gritty goal.
As the other American on stage, I was also shocked to find out that there's stuff beyond American politics happening in the world when I arrived here. What about other impressions from you guys on how this COP feels so far compared to your past experiences?
I would say it has been smooth. The infrastructure all works, which sometimes is a jerky start if things are not working, and that's happened in a couple of COPs in the past. At least that's a good place to be.
Yeah, this is only my second climate COP, but I have just come from the biodiversity COP in Cali, Colombia, and I think both Colombia and Azerbaijan have done an excellent job in terms of logistics. I would say that coming from Cali, and it ended, a week or so ago, the negotiations there fell apart on climate finance, sorry, not climate finance, on finance. And it was really, again, as usual, the developing versus the developed countries pitted against each other, and it was a very last-minute collapse. So I have to say that kind of coming into this event with this negotiation on the table doesn't kind of feel like a very, a very positive starting point. So I would say it's kind of an ominous outlook coming from there.
I was going to ask if you sort of drew any conclusions from having seen one finance-related COP sort of come to a bad result. I mean, is there a difference between how the discussions are operating here versus what you watched at the biodiversity COP?
So I would say, I mean, I haven't been so close to the political negotiations here as I was in Cali, but what struck me in Cali, which again I don't think sets a very good tone for this one, is that what it fell apart about was whether or not the developing countries, so the existing main fund for financing biodiversity is under the GEF, and developing countries see it as very, very developed nation dominated. And so they've been proposing to set up a new biodiversity fund under the COP, under the control of the COP. The old one, or the existing one, the GBFF, in any case expires in 2030, and the proposal on the table was to set up a new one from 2030 onwards. So it was pretty reasonable, but yeah, the developed nations on the last leg, in the early hours of Saturday morning, said no, and the whole thing fell apart. And it felt very political. It felt very, laying your cards down on the table. Rather than pragmatic and reasonable, to be fair. So yeah, again, coming into this from that, it doesn't set a very positive tone. And the negotiators here that I've spoken to have constantly referred back to that and how it's making them feel in terms of goodwill from negotiators on the other side and trust in the process.
And reading Natasha's story from a distance, there's one thing that you should recognize, which is that the Nature COP doesn't have the US as a part of the negotiations because the US never signed up to that treaty. The US might be leaving very soon, this COP, and so it's not just that Trump weighs over these negotiations. There are so many other factors.
That's very interesting. That is an interesting prelude to what might come next. So let's look at one thing that we already have accomplished here. John, you wrote about the Article 6 deal. Can you briefly kind of explain what it was a nice way to start the COP with a breakthrough? What was decided in those negotiations?
Yeah, so this is about Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. It's about agreeing on carbon market rules, so countries can exchange emissions credits that they've achieved through planting trees or through other technological solutions, and they can sell those, gaining climate finance, and countries which are looking for a cheap way to reduce their own emissions can buy these. So this is something, the Paris Agreement was in 2015, this is something that has not been agreed in the 10 years since. I mean, it's been log-jammed even since Glasgow. And we haven't agreed the whole thing yet, but we agreed one key part of it, which was the recommendations for Article 6.4, and that's basically to do with this UN-administered marketplace. We'll see if it emerges as a marketplace, so that has now been agreed. That was agreed on the first day. The Azerbaijan presidency really wanted that as an early victory. We still need to agree the mechanism for bilateral trades between countries. We could get that later this week or maybe next week, but I think it's looking fairly good as things stand that there will be a deal on that as well.
Now, Akshat and Natasha, I've had the privilege of editing a story that you've done for the past several years that looks at the overall carbon offsets market and the weight or the presence of the lowest, the junkiest kinds of offsets and how many companies are buying them. And it's actually been a good news story. We've seen those numbers going down over time. I know in the last piece that you did, there was some concern that this breakthrough might actually reverse some of that progress. Can you explain the sort of risk that we need to watch for now as the other side of Article 6?
Yeah, so well, first of all, the analysis that Aaron's referring to is about renewable energy credits, and the concern for a very long time now has been that these are not additional. So the additional financing that the carbon credits give to projects is not getting them over the line in terms of setting them up. So the non-additionality of the carbon credit projects. What this latest analysis found is that there's a huge chunk, and you've probably got the numbers in your head, but I don't, a huge chunk of renewable energy credits from the old clean development mechanism that have requested to transition into the new Article 6.4 market, and they've got a year in that market. So if this market sets up in early next year, the bulk of the supply, while the methodologies that were decided, the decision came on earlier this week, are ironed out, the bulk of the supply is going to be these junk renewable energy credits. Yeah. And the problem there is that a lot of banks and investors have been looking to the Article 6 market as a kind of a stamp of quality, of quasi-compliance credits. But for at least the first year, the issue is going to be that a lot of them are not going to have any real value in terms of the environment.
And the carbon market in general, the voluntary one, has been going through a phase of trying to improve the integrity of the credits in it. And so this UN-backed marketplace was a step everybody was looking forward to, that integrity will rise. As a result, people and corporations will feel more comfortable buying those credits. The numbers are astonishingly large. So 890 million credits may be coming on to the market, and more than half of them might be renewable energy credits. So, and there are a few other categories that are also considered less, less high integrity as people would want them to be. So that risk is something that negotiators were grappling with. The last two COPs could not get Article 6.4 agreed because of some of these issues, at least.
So we cleared a hurdle, but it creates other potential hurdles. So I do sort of want to switch gears now and talk about Trump, and I guess how I sort of imagined they would be sort of the lame duck American delegation, but you think not so lame. Can you tell us what has it been like covering the American delegation in the aftermath of last week's big developments?
Yeah, there's not a lot of laughter and smiles, although I will say what's again, I was expecting a lame duck delegation on some level, and there's I want to pull back for a second and just say, the U.S. obviously has been an unreliable ally in this space for long before Trump's first election, much less the one that happened last week, and so obviously other countries have come to be used to, being disappointed by the U.S. on finance, on climate deliverables. The U.S. didn't ratify the Kyoto Protocol, of course, at the beginning. So that's kind of the backdrop for the engagement that the delegation is having this week. And there is a sense from some of the counterparties as they're discussing, I'm told, that the U.S. will be back as they were under Biden, that a pullout that is expected under Trump, has promised under Trump from the Paris Agreement, if not the UNFCCC, will be temporary. Meanwhile, the finance goal, the NCQG, is something that is likely going to be locked in for 2035. The NDCs that are coming in February are for 2035 as well. So there is a sense that the discussions that are happening now still involve the U.S. The U.S. still, the commitments they make and the wording they prefer does matter. And just as a separate note, the team of negotiators working on behalf of the U.S., they are some of the best wordsmiths. They've been described to me, and I've seen it in action, as being some of the best wordsmiths, the folks who can really, land the right language and find the perfect language that is, that can make a deal at COP. We've seen that at past COPs. Those folks are career officials. they're the ones sitting in the room, and that expertise is still valued today.
It's not the most beautiful prose, but it's very powerful.
No one's quoting COP declarations, in poetry.
And I think what's also key is since we've been here, no one is thinking that other countries are going to follow the US out the door, right? The multilateral process will go on. That's what people keep saying out loud. They might be saying different things behind closed doors, but for sure they're saying no one's questioning the integrity of the Paris Agreement at this stage, at least.
And no one was counting on the US to provide a tremendous amount of climate finance either. Let's be real. I mean, the U.S. has stepped up its game. Natasha can talk about that probably, but the U.S. is not necessarily a reliable provider of finance, whether it's under Biden, a future Democratic president, or Trump.
I mean, I do want to ask you that question because you've been focusing on how the nations that are talking here are not actually always the source of the money that is being discussed. So if it's not coming from the US and it's not even necessarily coming from the parties to the conference, where is the money going to come from that everyone's talking about?
Yeah, so the story, I think it was this morning, I've lost track, but I just got kind of curious about the fact that we're here at a gathering of governments, and this is a multilateral a process under a UN body, the Conference of Parties, and yet if you look at what's on the table for the new collective quantified goal, everything that doesn't refer to provision of finance by provision of public finance from developed countries' parties is basically involving the private sector. So whether it's talking about mobilizing private funds within the inner circle of that onion, or if it's talking about the broader investment goal, this is all about private sector money. So the private sector, obviously everyone's here in the room and on the side events and stuff, but they're not sitting at the table. And the second point, which not at all to obviously contest the US's climate finance track record, the only point that comes to mind there is that they are the biggest, they have the biggest vote share and they're the biggest shareholder in most of the big development banks, not just the World Bank, but also the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank. Trump hasn't been obviously very friendly towards the multilateral agenda, so I think there's a big question mark there over the future of these institutions in terms of their financing and what that looks like. And that's not only a question mark over private finance and whether it can get involved, but also a question mark over these multilateral institutions and the extent to which they can, which pulls us back to the public provision of development finance of climate finance, which is seemingly getting slimmer and slimmer if you look at what's on the table. So
I mean,
big question mark.
Worth acknowledging that last time when Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement, or at least when he was elected, it happened while a COP was going on in Morocco, in Marrakesh. And it was a wild card. Like, you did not know what Trump was going to do. Was he going to follow through on his promises or not? And that discussion went on for much longer, what Trump would do, than it has so far in this COP. The transition is also at a very different place than it was that time. Today, we're spending $2 on clean energy versus $1, and that sum is $2 trillion versus $1 trillion. The amount of solar that the world is installing, they're not looking to the US for that money. China is building that solar, deploying it at home. So I think that also gives momentum in a way to stick to the Paris Agreement that perhaps the last time around there were deep, deep questions about.
And even in the US, we looked at the end of the Trump era and we saw that solar, and when it all had gone up, he had not actually halted progress in any way from those measures. Jen, can we do one last Trump look at what we've seen in terms of his cabinet moves as they would affect the things under discussion here or environmental policy back in the US? What's been happening over the past few days for people that have been focused on what's happening in Baku?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's early days, and certainly it is, but there's been a pretty speedy move to get these appointments named and decided. In the space that we most care about, the real appointment that we've heard about is Lee Zeldin to be the head of the Environmental Protection Agency. He's a former Republican representative from New York. He served 4 terms. He's notable in a couple ways. One, because he was a surprising choice. I don't think I've joked with some other reporters and checked in. No one had him on our dance card for EPA. He was not who we were hearing was being interviewed and who was being considered. He was a loyalist to Trump during the impeachment proceedings, and that seems to have been a factor here. He's a guy who's being called on to execute Trump's agenda of pulling back regulations on greenhouse gas emissions from power plants, from EVs, et cetera. And he's already shown in interviews and statements that he's up and ready for the job. We're looking at the creation potentially of an energy czar in the White House, a key national energy advisor that would replace essentially the role that Ali Zaidi now fills on the climate side, where he's the national climate advisor. Anyways, there's a shuffle that is surprising in that it goes beyond the expectations for a second Trump term to be filled, his cabinet to be filled with tacticians, professionals, experts who really knew from the last term how to go in and do the regulations. So far, we're seeing a lot of loyalists, folks who will follow his lead, and not necessarily the skilled tacticians who can rewrite the regulations quickly.
And just to plug that Ali Zaidi, the last, for now, climate czar, will be on stage with Akshat coming up later. So I guess I wanted to ask you guys all really quickly what the most interesting conversation you'd had so far at COP has been.
Well, I was surprised that I had the Exxon CEO sit down for an interview, in a 45-minute interview, at a climate conference, and there was no climate protest during that conversation. But it was nice for a CEO, any CEO really, of an oil company to sit down, but especially ExxonMobil, given the history of the company and very well documented history to try and sow doubt about climate science, but now turning around and saying, actually, we want the US to remain in the Paris Agreement, and that, well, if the US goes down a path that doesn't support low-carbon solutions, we have the rest of the world that wants those solutions, and we'll supply it to them.
Again, I guess it's no longer a surprise to see Exxon turning up at a climate summit, but it is sort of surprising to hear the standing up for the Paris Agreement. Is still shocks. John, what about you? What's been the most interesting conversation?
I think two things stand out for me. One is actually an event that was hosted by Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley. As some of you may know, she's emerged as kind of the superstar behind scaling up innovative sources of finance and rewriting the international architecture. And she was sitting next to Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, and obviously Spain's a country that has been hit by floods this month, quite significant ones. And they were both on the same side, sort of saying we need to start thinking about new sources of finance, whether that's a financial transactions tax, whether that's on extraction of fossil fuels. And then just secondly, I also interviewed Canada's Environment Minister, Stephen Guilbeault, this morning. And that's interesting because if you thought President Joe Biden's poll ratings were bad, then Justin Trudeau's are also pretty poor at the moment. And so you could end up with a whole North American continent that doesn't have a kind of climate progressive in office. And I think that would be the first time that's happened since 2008, probably in the election of Barack Obama. So that's something interesting to note as well.
Jen, anything stand out to you so far?
So I don't want to bring it back to Trump, but this honestly was the most striking conversation that I've had, and it was early. I was traveling here and traveling with a lot of U.S. officials, and without naming names, I'll just say that I was struck by a conversation where this person referred to the whole climate thing as a sideshow, and the comment, we're here at a climate conference. You're here to do hard work, negotiating these deals. What do you mean? And it was just, this person was still kind of reveling in what does the presidential victory mean for all other forms of multilateral diplomacy, not just climate. And it obviously set a tone for what was to come.
And finally, Natasha, anything remarkable so far?
Yeah, I suppose mine possibly a bit more niche, but about debt for nature swaps. So these have been really hyped up over the past couple of years as solutions where countries can refinance their debt and allocate any savings towards nature conservation. They were kind of pioneered by Credit Suisse, but we've since seen Bank of America and JP Morgan get into the market. And so I guess it was a conversation about how competitive the market's become, and in particular the margins that banks making being very small to the extent that it's questionable if they're making any money, which is interesting, obviously, in and of itself, but also because the deals have been criticized for being fairly heavy in transaction costs, in particular because there are investment banks involved. So curious point of conversation for me.
Now, I think I've only left time for just one question. Meg, do we have any from the audience?
Okay, if it's only one, I'll pick this one then. What criteria will you use to assess the success or failure of this COP?
Who wants to jump on that?
I mean, I think that's an easy one to answer because it is the big number of around NCQG, how much money will rich countries be giving to poor countries, and in what form? I think there's going to be a lot of back and forth over the language, and people will fudge things around. Do we end up with a deal, first of all, and whether that deal has any solid worth under the words?
Is there a dollar amount that it has to be above or below, and is that a dollar amount that's grants versus loans or something like that?
We hear hundreds of billions or trillions, that's it.
It's a big number either way.
But as a practical matter, it has to be more than 100 billion for the public finance piece. That is the mandate from the Paris Agreement.
And I think for me, we haven't mentioned it yet, but it's going to be whether China steps in and shows global leadership in the absence of the US.
Yeah, I think for me, under the climate finance goal, the portion that is truly attributable to public finance, because it's so hard to count, and anything else is going to be largely unaccountable. And in a context of kind of missed targets, I think that's problematic.
Well, thank you guys so much for being up here with me. Now back to work, and yeah, have a good rest of your COP.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage John Moore, CEO of Bloomberg NEF.
Good afternoon. Great to see everybody. Hope you're enjoying Baku. It's my first time in Baku. I'm impressed. It's really, really nice. The decisive decade. So we're in the middle of the decisive decade. In 2 months, it'll be 2025, which is that's pretty scary given how much we need to do. I have one chart just to illustrate that. On the left, you'll see historic emissions, energy-related emissions. On the right, you'll see the pathways. We have one, which is the economic transition pathway. So that's where economics alone will take us. So that's a downward trend, but that's to 2.6 degrees C. So that's not where we want to be. If we want to be on net zero, which for us is a 1.75 degrees C pathway, we need to reduce emissions by 37% in the next 5 years. So that really is the steep challenge. So we're really into implementation. And actually, we've been thinking about this for a few years now. And actually, we came up with a methodology to start to think about implementation because we cover 33 different commodities and technologies. Every transition is different by different geographies. This is a complex task. So the idea was to break this task down. If you're going to do a plan, you need to break the task down. And our methodology breaks it down into 4 pillars. You'll see those 1 to 4 there. So pillar 1 was deploying mature technologies. There are many technologies that work, that are cheap, cost-effective, just need to be rolled out very rapidly. Pillar 2 was around developing new technologies, bringing the cost curves down for some of these first-of-a-kind type projects. Phasing out, transitioning, shifting from carbon-intensive to low-carbon. And finally, putting a governance structure and some measurements around that. And you sort of need to do all of those 4 things. So if you need to do a transition plan, you can create these 4 buckets, and you need to think about activities that go in it. We actually have a whole methodology behind that with this report here that says for each of the key industries, what are the challenges in each bucket and what are the policies? We have 70-odd different policies online to help. But you can use it not just for policy, but also for implementation overall. So the short version of this is deploy, develop, shift, and measure. So those are my 4 shorthands for this methodology. And if we look at the deploy area, then what you see is that these are the technologies we'd need to decarbonize. And by 2050, 45% of it's to do with clean power. So clean power is basically half of the challenge. If you cut that back to 2030, I'll do this a number of times, it's over half. It's 55% of clean power. So when you're spending time on decarbonizing, half your time should be spent on this question alone. And quite a lot of progress has been made. So if you look last year in terms of capacity additions, only 6% of capacity additions were fossil fuel based, which is pretty amazing. So 91% were wind and solar, 94% were clean technologies. So that's pretty amazing. And if you look at what's happened with the key technologies, so wind and solar, you'll see solar has been 2.8-fold. So this is 2.8 times increase in the last 4 or 5 years, and we believe that to continue. The learning rate for solar is 28%, so for every doubling capacity, it gets 28% cheaper. You'll see on the right there, wind has also been scaling dramatically. So again, these are numbers of fold increases, huge increases, and it's a 14% learning rate for wind. So again, for every doubling capacity, it gets 14% cheaper. If you look at energy storage, that's even steeper. So that's been a 9-fold increase just since 2020, which doesn't seem that long ago, right? A 9-fold increase, and we think it's going to grow another 5-fold between now and the end of the decade. And what that means is that the tripling of renewable capacity, which was one of the COP28 goals, that is in sight. So you'll look where we were in 2022. You can see what our forecast is for 2030. It's not quite tripling, but it's getting close. So that's about deployment. So really the questions are about deployment, but there are challenges. So this is showing you what's sitting in the connection queue. So literally by US grid area or by European country, huge amount sitting in the queue. There's actually 3 or 4 times as much in the US queue as there is deployed out in the market. So massive amounts sitting in the queue. So getting those connected, getting those permissioned is a real challenge. The other key part of deployment is electrification, which is 23%, or if you think of it just by 2030, 14%. The biggest area of that is electric vehicles. So has the growth rate slowed down? It has. But it's still going to be 20-odd%. There are not many global markets growing so fast. Last year, it was 33% in terms of sales of EVs. And again, we think that's going to keep going. So it's up 5-fold first half of the decade. We think it's going to be up 3-fold for the rest of the decade. And what that actually means is the chart on the left shows you that internal combustion engine vehicle sales actually peaked in 2017. It was quite a while ago that was the peak of internal combustion engine vehicle sales. That's pretty amazing, right? And if you look on the right there, what you'll see is peak fuels across all forms of road transport, we believe will peak in about 2027. So we're getting close to that peak. And then the third thing I would talk about on deployment is the blue line is global demand for battery cells and solar modules. The red line is Chinese supply. The Chinese supply is actually double the global demand, which is, again, pretty amazing. So what that means is that prices are only going to come down. So there's going to be a huge drop in prices that will continue. The other thing that's happening is globalization of production. So there's been a big build out. Again, the IRA was one of the key things in the US, but around the world, people starting to build kit. So the other thing that's happening is people building kit in more parts of the world, which will be good for resilience. Will it slow things down? Maybe, but it'll mean when we get there, we'll have a more resilient build out of clean technology. So that's the other piece that I think people are less aware of, but has moved, as we can see, faster than needed, which is good news. So then there's the development question, which is what are the things that are actually much earlier stage? So this is about 1/5 of where we need to get to. So between now and the end of the decade. And I'll give you 4 different examples. So one is CCS. So the good news is we're just starting to see CCS type projects getting signed off and going live. So this is the Northern Lights project, which is in the North Sea. So this is taking CO2 liquefied and pumping it 2.5 kilometers underneath the ocean. You can see it's 1.5 million tons a year, but you can see the amount of increase there is a 178x that we'll need. Now, this project can also scale, and there'll be many others, but you can see where we are in that sort of much earlier stage type of evolution. And that affects the policies you need. It also affects the kind of capital you need. Hydrogen is another example. The bar on the right are what the targets would like to be. This is where we're aiming for. But you can see our forecast is that we'll get to about half of the target. It's not a supply issue. To the right of this is a bar twice the size, which is people working on supply. So the supply is not a problem here. It's about demand. But if you balance those two out, we're going to get about half of the way there. Again, early stage, we'll see how that plays out. The third example is on the right-hand side of this chart is commercial vehicles. So you can see on the left-hand side, two-wheelers, buses, passenger vehicles we talked about. The dark line in the middle is percent of sales. So you'll see it's only 6% of sales are commercial vehicles. But what you'll see is that's 41% emissions. So really, again, that is in the development phase, unlike passenger vehicles, which is in rollout. Again, different kind of money, different kind of policies. And the final example, of course, is sustainable aviation fuel. We all know about, I'm presuming not many people came here on the train. So we know where the demand is. It's really the supply issue. So again, the green bar here shows you sort of the most simple supply in terms of waste oils, but that only gets you to low percents. So again, you know, things like biofuels, those kinds of things really, really need to be scaled up. So that's the develop. And then we talk about shifting. And what the example here I'm going to use is carbon pricing. So we're actually now up to nearly a quarter of emissions are covered by some form of carbon market. And since the last 20 years, actually pretty much exactly 20 years, 2005 when the EU ETS started. And actually, that was one of the drivers in the last coal-fired power station in the UK closing down. So that was Radcliffe on Soar, which closed down earlier in the year. And carbon pricing, so that was fuel switching out of coal into gas, played a big part of that. So you can see actually this stuff, you know, it takes time, but it does work. And the EU ETS is actually expanding. So the purple power bars on the right there, those already included in scope. But road transport is about to be added. That's Europe's biggest emitting sector. And buildings, that's the third biggest after power. So again, it's going to be 70-odd% of emissions that are going to be covered. So again, that's a great example of how carbon markets can be used. But it's not just scope, it's also price. The green band is our estimate of where you need to be in terms of pricing for it to have a material impact. And you'll see the blue line at the top is actually the EU. So not only do they have scope, it's also got the right kind of pricing. So there are many other markets around, but the prices are really too low to have a key impact. And of course, the other thing that's going to affect the shifting is things like the trading challenges with things like tariffs. So in the last sort of week or two, that's been very much in the press. So really working out how trade between blocks really fits together. So again, that will also have an impact on the transition. And the final point was around measurement. So we need good measures in place if we're going to make this transition. So what this shows you is where have there been targets put in place for net zero. On the left, you can see, so this is still only 2020, which again is pretty amazing. In 2020, look at the red, 66% of emissions had there was nothing on it in terms of targets. That's now only 8%. So 92% of emissions are covered by some form of either a commitment or is under discussion. And again, think of what's happened in the last 4 or 5 years in terms of pandemics, inflation, wars, etc. That's a pretty amazing progress. But it's not just about that, it's also sustainable. Finance has also been sort of ramping up. The challenge there is lots and lots of rules and regulations have been put in place. Red means it's a mandatory. These are just numbers of. Orange means it's voluntary. But country by country, many different regulations have been put in place. The issue is it's very, very fragmented. So it's not just, it's sort of how do we implement those goals? Those goals are good to have, but then we need to be more organized, more structured about how we actually start to measure those and put in place some more standardized rules. One example of that is we've been doing work on ratios. So ratios seems to be a good way of helping to standardize how we think and how we measure. This is our energy supply banking ratios, which basically says how many dollars of clean investment do you need for every dollar in fossil fuels. And you'll see the blue boxes there will show you. So for this decade, we really should be in a 4-to-1 type ratio. So for every dollar in fossil fuels, we should be investing 4 in clean technologies. We're just under 1-to-1 right now. So again, we have a long way to go, but this ratio can be applied to financial institutions of any shape or size. So again, it's a useful standard measure. There'll be nuances around what's included, and that's normal, but in terms of standardizing, hopefully it's a step in the right direction. So that's sort of how we think about it. To be honest, I use this framework for quite a lot of things. If you have a round table and you're talking about the transition, you can use these 4 headings, because if you don't, you end up with a very complex discussion with people will be mixing very different kinds of technologies, very different kinds of policies. It's actually fairly difficult to have a coherent conversation. So I use this kind of structure very often. And if you want the details behind it, please look up this report. So as I say, this report covers many, the key industry sectors. It then covers each of the pillars, what are the issues, what are the solutions, and gives some examples, tangible examples of policies that have been put in place. So it's all about implementation now. It's going to be the second half of the decade. It's going to be an interesting ride. We look forward to working with you, and good luck for the rest of COP. Thank you very much.
Please welcome to the stage Andrew Steer, President and CEO of the Bezos Earth Fund, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Aaron Rutkoff.
Hello again, and thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
So I've been told something that I believe might be a scoop here on stage. I heard that you were just recently knighted. Is that right?
That was right, yes, last week in Windsor Castle.
Oh, congratulations on
Thank
that.
you.
Can I call you sir throughout the interview?
You can, yes.
So I wanted to sort of start by giving my understanding of the background of your approach, and you can tell me if I'm making any mistakes along the way. And so, one of the problems that I believe is being addressed by your work is that climate philanthropy is a very small percentage of the total world of philanthropy, something like 2%. And so the work that you're doing is kind of a corrective to that. You have $10 billion to distribute, is that right? And I guess as a starting point, you are now probably one of the only climate knights and one of the most powerful people in climate philanthropy. Is that an accurate assessment?
Well, we're very privileged to be stewards of $10 billion that will be provided as grants this decade. And it's an important decade. It's not just for climate, it's for nature as well, and always through the lens of people.
So the philosophy, as I've understood it, and I've following your work, and I listened to your podcast when you came onto the Zero podcast, is that you are going places where governments feel like it might be too politically risky to go with money. You have ability to distribute your grants there. Are there examples of your work that sort of fit that description of taking a risk that governments don't feel safe doing?
Well, as philanthropists, we have to sort of figure out what our comparative advantage is. We're able to move quickly. We don't have, congressional committees you might be called before. We don't necessarily have so many, journalists that are wanting to trash what we're doing, although they can do that, by the way. So we ask the question always, where can we inject resources quickly, boldly, in a way that will remove barriers from reaching positive tipping points? We run something together with the World Resources Institute called the System Change Lab. That looks at the 50 transitions that need to take place this decade and the next. And we ask the question, how close are they to the tipping points where beyond which change becomes irresistible and unstoppable. And then we ask what's stopping them getting there, and that's where we try and allocate our resources. And sometimes, as you say, it's in areas that maybe governments are less keen to go, and the private sector's not willing to go yet. So there's a sort of window of opportunity for us there. So, for example, the work we're doing in the Congo Basin it is risky, but it's worth it because it's one of the 3 great tropical forest areas. It's the only one of the 3 at the moment that is still absorbing very substantial amounts of carbon dioxide. So it's very, very important it be protected.
So when you last spoke to my colleague Akshat Rathi, I think this was January of 2023, and you had $1.6 billion from the $10 billion fund that had been distributed that was out the door. I know much more than that is committed or pledged. Here we are about 2 years later. How far along are you on the $10 billion that you need to shed before the end of the decade?
It's roughly $2.5 billion. So our philosophy has very much been, look, you start by trying things out, and then if they really work, then you scale it. So we're trying to develop some product lines that will then, year after year, deliver. Because, in our line of business, you don't solve something with a one shot. There aren't silver bullets. It's a journey. And so, for example, we're doing work on alternative proteins. We just this year put $100 million into researching alternative proteins, whether plant-based or fermented or lab-produced proteins. You need basic science to some extent to do that. So we're financing 3 major research labs in different parts of the world. But that's just the beginning. So we would expect to stick with that issue year after year and scale it up.
So you take what you learn from the early projects, and that allows you to accelerate the expenditure from the fund.
Yeah, it's sort of like, a little bit of a sort of venture capital approach. Now, what you can't afford to do is just have pilot successes. The urgency is so great nowadays that, anybody can have a pilot success here or there. So even in our first sort of shot efforts, take, say, the Congo Basin. Lots of people working on the Congo Basin, seeing different parts of the elephant. So what we did is say, look, we want to put $130 million to be helpful here. Pick the 10 best institutions in the world and say to them all, look, you are expert in your own areas. We'll give you each, 10 million or something like that. You've got to deliver within your own expertise, and you've got to be part of a team with us. And for the first time ever, we work as a team, and that means you have access to heads of state, you have access to major European countries who care a lot about the Congo Basin, and you try and make the whole add up to the sum of the parts. And that's what's really missing at the moment. If you think about the challenges we've got, think about the electricity grid in East Africa, for example. It's a huge challenge. Nobody on their own, the World Bank on its own can't be helpful. The African Bank can't be helpful. What we're missing is what we call a deal team for the planet. What we ought to be doing is saying, for heaven's sake, we are in an emergency, and what we need to do is bring all the players to the table. It's all very well saying blended finance and going to lots of seminars on the subject, but actually you need to get everyone around the table with their sharp pencils and with their checkbooks. And it needs to be done at a senior level. And so that's one of the things that we are trying to introduce in the way we do business.
And do you see less risk-tolerant capital following in your footsteps where you lead the way? Has that been a pattern you've observed so far?
I think so. For example, one thing we work on with a wonderful group called Allied Climate Partners, led by Mark Galogli and his team at 3 Cairns. The riskiest part of any large investment is the first 2 years. It's when you're designing it and you're bringing it to financial closure. And private companies, for very understandable reasons, aren't keen to do that. So what's happened in the past, which is very good, is that the grant funding, for example, what's called PIDGE in Africa, prepare the project, then sell the project on, if you like. The problem is you can never scale that because there's not enough grant. So what we've done, together with Allied Climate Partners, we put junior equity in, essentially. We take the first loss, and then, quite honestly, sometimes a third of the projects never reach financial closure. We take the loss then. Mm-hmm. But then, if they do reach financial closure, it's sort of pari passu return. So the modeling suggests that we will then be able to rotate the money, revolve the money. Now, what's it got to do with your question? Well, for the first time ever now, because we put in that first loss, private sector, in the first instance, like DFCs, development finance corporations, are willing to come in, put their money in, and before long, private sector money, genuine private sector money will come in. So you're changing the system, if you like. So that's exactly the kind of thing that we like to do.
I want to pause for a moment and just say, as we get towards the end of this, 15 minutes from now, there'll be an opportunity for questions. So if you use the online system and you have questions for Andrew, then I'll be able to ask those. Now, I wanted to talk about 2030, right? It's actually very great that you're here today, because we've just, my team has been looking at climate goals with 2030 as the cutoff point, which is the same date by which you're meant to deplete your $10 billion. I'm very optimistic about your ability to do that, but based on our work assessing the world's 2030 climate goals, I would say I'm a bit more pessimistic after this. Unfortunately, based on the work we just published yesterday, we're lagging behind on many of the climate goals, which I'm sure comes as no surprise to people who would be here at COP. But so I was hoping maybe I could be the pessimist and you could kind of give me a more optimistic perspective. So, I wanted to look, for starters, at the work you do on biodiversity. My colleague Natasha was just covering the biodiversity COP, which did not come to a successful result. And if you just look at the numbers, the 30 by 30 goal that the world is trying to meet to set aside 30% of the oceans and the land as a protected, just very, very far behind on the numbers. So the money that you're deploying in biodiversity, do you feel like there's a way to sort of shift the momentum towards progress?
Well, first, I didn't know you were going to be talking about this when I read your fantastic article yesterday. By the way, I hope everyone has signed up to Bloomberg Green. It really was a very good article, and I actually agreed with it. It basically says, here are the targets, and we're off track. We do that similar analysis with our system change lab, and of the 50 transitions, only one of them is actually on track. Okay. And even that might be dubious right now. So I actually agree with the message.
You're supposed to be the optimist here.
But let me be a little more optimistic, starting on the nature side of things. Well, one thing it's important to remember, people say, oh, the Paris deal is failing. Important to remember that the Paris deal, before the Paris deal, we were heading towards a 4-degree Celsius increase in temperature. We're now heading towards a 2.5 to 3 degrees Celsius. I mean, name another period of 9 years where that much progress has been made. Remember also the either brilliance or foolishness of the Paris deal, according to your views. I think it's brilliant. It was a very modern system. The idea was, actually, we can't do a textbook system. The textbook, which we tried in Copenhagen back in 2009, the textbook would say the way to do it is how much carbon dioxide can the upper atmosphere absorb? X, gigatons. All right, now let's allocate the gigatons among nations. And if you emit more than you're allowed to, we put you in prison or we tax you or something like that. Well, the world isn't ready for that. The world wasn't ready for that. Maybe one day it will be, but it's not now. So it was a voluntary system, and its brilliance was, in the first round of NDCs, nobody, at least nobody who understood the situation, expected them to be strong enough to solve climate change. They were always going to be suboptimal. The idea was every 5 years, technology prices would come down, the cost of of climate change would increase, citizens would demand more, and so you would start to get that forward momentum. And that is what has happened. Albeit, we didn't understand there are political cycles where suddenly some countries are doing things too boldly and undermining well-being of people in the Midwest or whatever. And so I think we were a bit naive on that regard, but overall it is working, but nowhere near enough. So take nature, for example. We've worked very, very hard to get the so-called 30 by 30. We financed the political lobbying. We were amazed, and we don't take the credit for it because many others worked too, when 198 countries or whatever, even the United States, which is not a member of the Biodiversity Convention, agreed to 30 by 30. Now, as you said in your articles yesterday, So far about 17% of land is protected and 9% of oceans are protected. You need to do a whole lot more. That's what we and others are spending a lot of effort right now. Some countries like Colombia, President Duque, before he left office, he said, what is the situation now? Ours is about 20%. Let's immediately go up to 30. He did. And the new government is actually honoring that. And so you're starting to see some pretty interesting things. At the last COP, 16 heads of Pacific Islands agreed that they would manage 100% and they would protect 30%. They're now preparing plans to put those in place. We put $100 million on the table, said if you come up with good plans, we will help finance them. And so we've got to understand the notion of sort of exponential change. As Al Gore always likes to say, things take much longer than you ever hoped for, and then they happen much more quickly than you expected.
So in other words,
so that's where the sort of the exponential part of it is our source of hope.
So the last 5 years don't have to match the speed of the next 5.
Indeed not. Indeed not. In fact, now we should be starting to get into that inflection point where things start improving more rapidly, even with political change.
So one aspect of technology, since you mentioned that as one of the elements that you're looking at that wasn't something anyone was really talking about 5 years ago, that's now very much on the table, is AI. There are other journalists at Bloomberg who are covering the money story with AI or the technology story. Unfortunately for the climate and energy journalists, it's a story of costs and impacts, because there's just an immense amount of energy that's required, and it's often not clean energy. So do you feel like right now that AI is capable of making a positive contribution to climate as opposed to just being a sort of cost in terms of the energy use?
Well, we don't know, but we're experimenting. So we created a $100 million competition, if you like, and we've just got the first round, and we've cut it down from 2,000 odd proposals down to 30, and we're going to give them small grants to start with, and then of those 30, 15 of them will receive bigger grants, 6 months from now, sort of thing. And it's in nature and climate. And if you read these proposals, we haven't yet finalized the decision yet, but you look at the proposals, it's actually remarkable what AI can do in nature, for example, in recognition. So, for example, small thing, there are at least 8 million species of creatures. We've only actually measured 1.8 million of them. We don't know even how many there are. There could be as many as 50 million. AI can massively accelerate the rate at which you identify new species, and it can massively accelerate the recognition of existing species, and it can help you protect those. And so it can do through sound, sight, and DNA recognition, it can identify almost immediately what a species is. It can identify if this one has not been identified before. It can then figure out what family and what subfamily it's in, and so on. And so that's just one small example, but there are many, many examples. We also asked for proposals on the electric grid. If you take a country like Vietnam, it's actually invested a lot in renewable energy. But of that renewable energy, less than 50% is entering the grid. Why? Because the grid isn't smart enough and the grid isn't strong enough. AI can help you not only make it smarter so you can adapt, but also helps you identify exactly where to make it stronger. So, there are many examples. And another one is we work a lot, as I was saying, on alternative food. What is beef? It's just a whole lot of proteins and other chemicals, if you like. Well, there are 200 million proteins that have been identified. So getting the right combination is unbelievably too difficult for you and me or any scientist, but actually AI can actually sort things through and do millions of computations so that you start moving towards something that's not only as tasty, but it actually chemically is identical to beef, and is cheap or cheaper, so to speak. So yes, we're very hopeful.
And do you, I know the decision hasn't been made, or at least not announced, but when will these AI grants be made? Is it coming up very soon?
Yes, I mean, in the next month we'll be announcing these preliminary grants, and then the bigger grants sort of sometime in the spring. Yes.
Now you mentioned Vietnam. Am I correct? You have quite a background of work in Vietnam. Is that right?
Yeah, I lived there for 5 years. I was running the World Bank program there some years ago.
I'm just curious, as someone with that kind of experience, have you seen a big example of change there in terms of the energy transition based on when you were there with the World Bank?
Oh yes, I mean, when I went there, there are only, I think, 32% of rural dwellers had access to electricity. Now it's 99.5%. They have electrified cheaply and effectively, faster than any country, but it's through coal. They are very, very good at generating electricity from coal. What they've now agreed to do is to say, actually, we won't go that route anymore. We will go the route of renewable energy. And they've invested quite a bit in that. But they say they need help. And the so-called Just Energy Transition Partnership, which the G7 did with them, was to provide them $17 billion. The problem is the money isn't coming from the country. So you've got this fascinating situation where the countries now, the G7, are sort of trying to get the private sector to go in and so on, but basically say, no, the government of Vietnam needs to move its policies. Government of Vietnam is saying, well, actually, we're sort of out on a limb on this because we've made these commitments, we want to honor them, but we need some help. I mean, actually, offshore wind in the north of Vietnam takes quite a lot of design work, for example. We need upfront money, so to speak. So we're now at that fascinating stage where you've got sort of both sides sort of interested, but they're not dancing. It's like a high school dance, you know, with the girls on one side and the boys. And so the trick is, and that's where maybe philanthropy can be helpful, actually, by sort of getting there and making it a little easier.
So I want to borrow hope from you on another topic. We do a lot of work on methane, and it's a place where in the recent COPs, there have been many announcements of bilateral pacts, industry-wide initiatives, and it's one where we're not seeing yet a ton of progress. In fact, I think methane levels from fossil fuel are still near their record levels. Is there work that the fund is doing where you think it might help change that in the next 5 years?
Yeah, yes. So, I mean, we finance something called Methane Sat, which is an environmental defense fund. Satellites just gone up a couple of months ago. It now is just coming on stream for the first time. There are several satellites measuring methane, but this is rather unique. It can measure just the right sort of, if you like, geographical spread, and then other satellites can look in a lot more detail. So yeah, we will know a year from today, we will be able to know in real time exactly where methane is leaking from. And and then we're investing also in okay, what do you do with that data? How do you use it to lobby? How do you inform people? But perhaps a bigger program for us is the second most polluting species on the planet, which is cattle, of course, and they're the second. We're the first, of course, and they're the second because of us. And methane is, as you know, is currently the worst source of climate change. And we're on a path to destruction if we keep eating beef at the rate of growth we are right now. And so it's incredibly important. So we're investing in vaccines that will lower by 40% or so methane from cattle. We're investing in alternative forage mechanisms because the average cattle in Colombia or Brazil has 1 to 2 hectares each. They don't need it. It's just that there's no pasture management. So that's the second thing. And the third, the most important thing is, even though we're not trying to turn everyone into vegetarians, we simply cannot keep eating meat at the growth rates we are now. We would lose the Amazon. We would lose the battle against climate change. And so it's incredibly important that we recognize that we take a long-term view. 50 years from today, we will be eating differently. It will be just as delicious. It will maybe even have the same composition. It will be cheaper. It will be more nutritious. and it will protect the planet.
So one last topic, and then I'm going to leave it to audience questions. But my team does a lot of work on carbon markets, and I know it's a place where you and the fund are heavily involved. I know the fund supports the work of Science-Based Targets Initiative, which has been such an important resource for us to try to separate out what is a useful carbon offset from stuff that is less effective. And I guess, again, to borrow from your optimism, our work leads me to be somewhat skeptical about the way these things work, at least in a totally voluntary market that we just see over and over again, more empty offsets being sold, the market being taken over by them. Is there a way that you feel like the voluntary market can be a useful force, or are we going to continue to see sort of like low-quality offsets spread?
Every new market goes through phases, and there's always a lot of abuse. My wife comes from Bruges in Belgium, and if you go to Bruges, you can see the first stock market in the world, 13th century. It took us about 700 years to get stock markets where they needed to get. We don't have that time. There is no reason at all why we can't do carbon markets right. We now have 2 standard-setting organizations, ICVCM on the supply side, VCMI on the demand side, run by extremely good professionals, best in the world. And there's no reason at all why we should not, for example, if you are a good company that is honoring science-based targets in scope 1 and 2, and you're doing your very best on scope 3, there's no reason in our book why you shouldn't be allowed to offset, if that's what you want to call it, or compensate for the scope 3, which is incredibly difficult to reduce, and use that to help Indonesia close down a coal plant. Actually, that's perfectly measurable. You know when a coal plant, and you know if there are any others that are going to be opened, so you can have what's called a jurisdictional approach. At the moment, companies, the best companies in the world that might have 300,000 suppliers, even if they contact all of those suppliers, it's very difficult for those suppliers to go down to 0 on their own scope 2, which would be scope 3 for the big company, so to speak. My daughter, who's an environmental student, last year did an internship with a very major company and was asked to manage this huge database where they looked at 1,000 of their suppliers. They knew the energy use of all of those suppliers, and they had contacted all of them. And a lot of these suppliers in a place like Vietnam, for example, they would say, actually, we'd love to. 1, we don't really know how to measure our emissions, but 2, we can't get green electrons here. All the electrons that come through the wires are brown. What do you want us to do? So our view is you could absolutely compensate that and help Vietnam on its offshore wind, and then maybe there would be green electrons.
So to me, that actually does make a lot of sense at the level of the green incentive in Vietnam. But is it a problem? Is the incentive structure broken in terms of the companies who might prefer to do an offset rather than something that costs more money, and even to some of the sources who can flood the market with things that look indistinguishable from a truly meaningful offset from Vietnam, greening Vietnam?
Well, there will always be companies that are going to do greenwashing. We can't stop that. I mean, it's free for them to do it. They're doing it now. But there is a growing group of fantastic companies that actually are trying their very best. And they are on track on scope 1 and 2. And they're trying their best on 3. Those are the ones that we want to honor and, if you like, certify under what we call the Energy Transition Accelerator.
Meg, do we have any questions from the audience?
How do we get the private sector around the table as part of the global deal team? At the moment, there are a lot of expectations of the private sector, but they are rarely in the room when the big conversations are taking place.
Well, that's right, but they're willing to be in the room. I mean, the good ones would like to be in the room. And at the moment, the multilateral banks, and by the way, Ajay Banga at the World Bank is doing a great job. I mean, I think he's taken this on as his #1 goal, is to get sort of more leverage with the private sector. But at the moment, it doesn't happen because it's a cultural thing. They come at it from different places. And so when the G7 went to South Africa to do the first JETP, it wasn't even people from their treasury departments. It was people that are good diplomats, but they didn't invite the private sector with them. They didn't invite many of the players that should. So you're right, they're not in the room, but they would like to come. The good ones would like to come into the room. We've got to make it work, because if we don't, we won't succeed.
Time for one more. How do elections such as the recent U.S. election affect your planning and giving in terms of reaching the fund's goals?
It's a good question, one I meant to get to.
Oh, yeah. Well, look, there's the economics of the last century, and there's the economics of this century. The economics of the last century said if you want to deal with climate change, it may be a nice thing to do, but it's going to cost you in terms of competitiveness, in jobs, and investment. In 2024, it's a very different story. If you care about competitiveness, if you care particularly about longer term or even medium term growth, if you care about jobs, if you care about the future, if you care about your families, then there is no alternative. There is yesterday's way of doing business, there's tomorrow's way of doing business. And the good news is that, we understand that issues of competitiveness and growth and jobs are actually pretty central to what Mr. Trump plans to do. So, elections change lots of things, but they don't change the laws of physics.
That's a great, optimistic place to end it. Sir Andrew Steer, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Aaron. Great pleasure.
Please welcome to the stage Ali Zaidi, White House National Climate Advisor, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Akshat Rathi.
Welcome to Bloomberg Green, and welcome back to the Zero podcast.
Fantastic to be with you.
Now, last time we talked, about 2 years ago, India and Pakistan were going at it at the World Cup. And you were celebrating the US having passed the largest climate legislation ever passed. Now, there's good news and bad news. The good news is India has actually won a World Cup since then.
But who's keeping score?
Right? And Pakistan, well, has had a few climate impacts. And the other bad news is, well, Trump is coming to power. And we don't know whether the largest climate bill that the Biden administration was able to pass will be able to get all the money, all the incentives that it has out the door. How worried are you?
I am less worried than you might think I am. And it's because in the architecture of our climate strategy, we anticipated a handoff to the private sector to carry us the distance. I think of the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, as the booster packs on a rocket, but the rocket is the private sector. And I think what we will see next year and the years after is that during this period of time, we were able to achieve escape velocity in the United States on critical areas of decarbonization. I am worried about parts of the inflection point which, to me, feel very fragile. One of them is our ability to sustain the manufacturing renaissance that's taken off in the United States. We know that federal policy is so critical to incubating that industrial capacity build-out. And in a couple of key areas, I think we might fall back if policy is reversed course.
So the Trump administration is promising to cut taxes, and that means it's going to have to try and find money from places. I know that there is a lot of money from the Inflation Reduction Act that's going to go to Republican states. That might stick around. But there are certain types of incentives that might actually be cut immediately or maybe phased down sooner than planned. A couple of them that come to mind: electric vehicle tax credits might go altogether. The clean electricity tax credit might be phased down early. Do you think those two sectors have met this rocket escape velocity that you hope?
Well, look, I think that the American people are very focused, and rightfully so, on pocketbook issues, including the cost of energy. Those electricity tax credits are tax cuts that flow through to utility payers who now see lower energy bills. You can literally go to utilities around the country where they will tell you how much the price of electricity came down and how much families are benefiting because of investments from the Inflation Reduction Act. So I think it would be problematic, not from just a climate perspective, but from a retail economics perspective, if there were to be a reversal on that. On your point about is it easy to undo this, look, 9 out of every $10 from the grant side of our investment agenda is in some form or fashion already into the economy. Most of the tax credits, 21 out of 24, have some guidance associated with them and are moving forward. And, you know, I believe, and I think this is manifest in the politics in Washington, that we have grown the political consensus around the Inflation Reduction Act through its execution, which evidence point one is the letter from House Republicans to their own leader saying, hey, let's stop trying to repeal something that would unplug a bunch of jobs and economic opportunity in our districts.
Well, ideology has never been more powerful in American politics than it is perhaps now, or at least in recent history, perhaps it is now. We are starting to see some of the Trump administration's appointees, and what we are noticing is that last time around, you know, there was perhaps a little bit of ineffectiveness because the people who had been appointed did not know all the ways in which they could get their ideology deployed. This time around, we expected many more people to be people who know the rules, who know how to break the rules. But there are also a lot of loyalists being put. And so there are wild cards that could be coming your way. Aren't you worried about those?
Look, if you work on climate change, you're always counting on there being wild cards. But I think there's a real robustness in the system. The first part we talked about already, and that's the private sector and the role it's going to play in, I think, continuing to pull the policy certainty along. They have made $1 trillion worth of investment bets predicated on a policy regime. They're not going to want to see the rug pulled out from underneath that.
Yeah, well, we had the ExxonMobil CEO yesterday telling us that the U.S. should not pull out of the Paris Agreement.
Yeah, and that's not your most obvious ally in this fight, but not only calling for staying in Paris, but also calling to keep intact the incentives that have been put in place. So I think there's that piece of it. I think the robustness also comes from state policy. You've got more than half of the states that have Democratic leadership and very much engaged in advancing clean energy, but that actually ignores the fact that you have a bunch more Republican governors whose entire economic theory rests on investments from the Inflation Reduction Act. You go to a place like Oklahoma, Governor Stitt, an amazing leader in attracting private investment to his state. Most of that private investment is clean energy. Governor Kemp in Georgia, most of that investment, clean energy. Go to South Carolina, Governor McMaster, most of that new investment, clean energy. So if you want to see the politics of this, you look at the House where they've written to their leader, you look at the private sector where they've put the bet on clean energy future, you look at the states where they're continue to run towards clean energy. This is actually a much more robust system with a lot more momentum behind it than we had in 2017. So I hear you on the risk factors, but I'm focused on the incredible momentum, and I think that's where I put my stock.
Now let's look at the international front. We are here at COP29. Negotiators are going to have to battle out something that is perhaps going to be the hardest thing that many experts are saying since the Paris Agreement, because it's all about money. And especially rich countries, especially the US, does not like to talk about money as much when it comes to hundreds of billions of dollars that need to be given to developing countries. Before we get into the details, the first thing that's going to happen is that Donald Trump says he's going to pull the US out of the Paris Agreement again. Let's see if he listens to the ExxonMobil CEO.
Yeah.
But if he doesn't, that means the US is not party to negotiations within 1 year of him making that decision. And that creates a credibility gap right now in these really difficult negotiations. Are the other negotiators taking you and your colleagues seriously?
I think the U.S. has built up quite a bit of credibility over the last 4 years, including an announcement I made today about a $3 billion target that the president had set in 2021 to mobilize adaptation finance into the developing world, the PREPARE initiative. We actually met that goal a year early, and we'll meet it again next year. But, you know, I would be sugarcoating it if I suggested that U.S. leadership going into next year from the federal government has a bright and positive halo around it in global climate conversations. I think people hear what has been said, they read what has been written, and they largely believe it. And as a result, that I think diminishes the U.S. federal position as the rules are being written on the clean energy economy of the future. And that comes to the detriment of U.S. businesses and U.S. workers. So I think that's a problem if we don't sort of see this through. In terms of the conversation that's happening right now, it's all about bringing more countries in around an ambitious target for 2035, which is quite a ways away. I think the bigger that coalition is and the bolder that ambition is, the more likely, if that might be counterintuitive, but the more likely we are to pull through on the other side and deliver the resources that are necessary to lift up the entire world in adapting to these challenges.
Why is that? Why do you think a bigger target will make it easier given the US is likely to leave?
I think if it is a target that is fit to purpose, that actually meets the moment, there will be more of a pull to get it done. If it's, you know, an anemic target, I think that makes it less exciting for people to really put their weight behind it. And I think the broader the coalition, the more likely it is that, you know, when one country falls back, the others pick up the slack, and so on and so forth. We pull each other through in the end.
But the Biden administration under the president has not been able to meet all the many commitments on the international front. So the Green Climate Fund was supposed to get $3 billion. It's only got $2 billion. Are you going to fill that gap before the president leaves the White House?
You know, the president made an overarching commitment on climate finance, $11 billion. And that was something the vice president talked about in Dubai when she was there. And a nested element of that is the $3 billion I just talked about. I have all the confidence in the world that the U.S. will be able to meet that overarching target, which when it was set, I think surprised everybody, felt like an ambition well beyond business as usual. And I think if we're able to deliver that, able to close that out, that will show the seriousness with which this administration has tried to pursue these objectives.
And if we look a little bit beyond COP29 till you still are in power, there is a big requirement under the Paris Agreement where countries have to submit their new climate pledges that will go out, as you said, till 2035. The US, as the world's second largest emitter, and what it decides in those pledges, even if it eventually leaves, that decision will make a big impact on how other countries follow through. So this nationally determined contribution, as it is called, what are you going to put in it that will make sure it matches the language that was signed off on at COP28 on transitioning away from fossil fuels?
Yeah, look, as we approach this, and this has been an analytical project that we've been undertaking with the entire federal government over the past year, one of the things that we're looking at is how does it carry forward all of the elements of what was decided in Dubai, including the need to remain tightly aligned with 1.5 degrees and keeping that in our sights. On fossil, you know, one of the things that I think we've tried to do pretty effectively in the United States is really bring a screen to long life infrastructure and think about how what we are building either matches or does not match that test of 1.5 degree alignment. I'm not here to roll out the nationally determined contribution, so you'll have to stay tuned. But the analysis and the work that we've been doing has both been looking at what Dubai called for and what we are committed to, as well as what is really incredible momentum from state and local governments and the private sector, and sort of runaway techno-economics that support greater and greater ambition in this space.
Say it comes before January 20th, this nationally determined contribution. Even on current trajectory, and even if all the policies that are in place stay intact, the US is not on track to meet its 2030 goals. You're going to have to, as a science-based target, set more ambitious goals going out to 2035, and then Trump is coming to power, and he's likely to roll back many of these initiatives. So what leaves the US with credibility at the end of that administration, or even as you submit this climate pledge? Is it just back to the old days of do what we say, not as we do?
I think if you look at the targets the US has set in previous NDCs, and our track record, notwithstanding zigs and zags in political leadership in Washington, what you see is that the combination of the federal government working with state and local governments and the private sector have been able to meet those goals. 2010 effort, 2015. Some of the domestic, set aside the NDC, some of the domestic regulations that we set, including for the power sector during the Obama administration, that were rolled back, we ended up actually exceeding those from a performance perspective in the power sector. As I look out to 2025, 2030, 2035, I have confidence that we will continue to set and meet targets, notwithstanding shifts in politics. It's not helpful, don't get me wrong, it is not helpful to have potentially a period of time where the federal government is either trying to slow or stymie the progress. What we actually need to be doing right now is investing more in things like our industrial capacity being cleaner and more competitive, our agricultural sector being more resilient and more competitive. If we fail to do that, we will have missed a massive economic opportunity. But if you look backwards, I think that gives you a hopeful track record and data points to project forward. I think we can, in fact, keep ratcheting up.
One reason why the Inflation Reduction Act has some more teeth than would have been otherwise is because there was recognition from the Republican side that China is eating the US lunch when it comes to green technologies. This next 4 years are likely going to grow that gap, even with the Inflation Reduction Act staying as it is, as you would hope it stays. What happens when you come back, say, in 2028 as a Democratic president back in power, and the gap between the US and China is bigger when it comes to green technologies? How do you catch up?
If 4 years from now we have fallen further behind China, I think that's economic malpractice at the federal policy level. I think the science is not unsettled on climate change, and yet folks articulate it as a matter of belief. But even if you set that aside, the economics are clear. These are technologies invented in the United States. When we invest in their manufacturing capability and deploy them domestically, there is unambiguous economic upside and energy security upside. It would be economic malpractice to put us back in the position we were 4 years ago, where we were in a massive deficit in the leadership of these technologies. So I understand your question, which is what happens if that deficit exists. I don't know if we come out of the ditch. So I'm actually I'll root for anybody who puts America's economic interests first. And I'm going to root for the next Congress, the next administration, finding a way, whether it's motivated by climate or not, to invest in our industrial strength and invest in our energy security and invest in our ability to make the technologies that we pioneered in the United States, make them cheaper, make them better, and help them translate into jobs and economic opportunity.
So far, what the Trump administration has said is there's going to be an energy czar in the White House, not a climate czar. So what happens after January? You're taking part and becoming part of the resistance, which was created after the first Trump administration?
Well, the good news is I won't get shown up by the next climate czar. No, I am eager to be part of civil society and to root for the success of a country I love and to find a way to plug into the imperative of our times, which is that we rise to meet the moment on climate change. Whether or not Joe Biden is in office or Donald Trump is in office or whomever, we are in the decisive decade for climate action. Climate action is not on pause over the next 4 years. It's on all of us to figure out how we accelerate progress at home and abroad on that.
Thank you, Ali.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Avinash Prasad, Special Advisor on Climate Change to the President at the Inter-American Development Bank, and Vera Songway, Chair and Founder of the Liquid Sustainability Facility, for a conversation with Bloomberg's John Anger.
And she will be joining us very, very shortly. Avinash, so obviously you were introduced there as the special advisor to the president of the IADB. Actually, I first came across you when you were a key architect of the Bridgetown agenda with your close friend, Mia Motley. You're now putting some of that into action in your new role. And one of the places you're doing so is in Brazil. Can you just tell us a little bit about that, how you're transferring money from where it is expensive to where it is cheap, and what that means and how that can contribute to this climate finance?
So, as you know, the financing gaps on climate are huge. And we think that the way to make it all add up is to break it down. You always break down big things into small things. And we break down climate action into things that generate revenues, things that generate savings, things that are just costs. And the things that generate revenues, we need to get the private sector involved. Solar farms, wind turbines make money, but they're not flowing to developing countries, that money, because the cost of capital is really high. And why is the cost of capital high? What does that mean? It's because there's a shortage of capital. I mean, almost the definition of developing countries is they don't have enough cash. So low savings, big investment needs means capital is scarce. So we need to bring capital from where it's abundant and cheap to where it is scarce and expensive and create that channel. And we're trying to do that in Brazil. And we find that the biggest obstacle in that channel is foreign exchange risk and managing foreign exchange risk. So foreign exchange risk, this is long-term, this is very pro-cyclical, and the banks are managing it, and the banks are short-term and also pro-cyclical. Come along, Vera. And so the banks aren't able to manage this risk very well, and their regulators know that, and so they charge big premiums. And those premiums, like 5 percentage points more than the actual risk, that's premium, is just blocking the flow of capital. So what we're doing is we're saying, well, we're committing to lend dollars when it's needed, US dollars when they're needed, or euros when they're needed, and making that commitment, and we'll lend long-term and low cost. And with that knowledge, that commitment, the projects and investors don't need to have that expensive hedging. So that's what we're trying to do in Brazil. We launched it in March with about $5 billion.
And how easily will that be rolled out to other places, do you think? I mean, what are you seeing already as you're doing this?
You know, so much of where the success stories in renewable energy around the world, Brazil, India, it's almost entirely domestically financed. And we're very much focused on the large and middle-income countries. Countries are not eligible for concessional finance, but we're not going to save the planet if India, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, Mexico, these big middle-income, large countries where the future energy demand is huge, if that future energy demand is in fossil fuels, then we've lost 2 degrees, we've lost 3 degrees. And so we're focused on those countries where we think the rollout will be easier. We're not focused on, say, Zambia, Gambia, Barbados, tiny countries, big middle-income countries where there are markets, but the cost of hedging is expensive.
Great. Vera, thanks for taking the stage. I'd like to ask you, I mean, obviously we're here, it's day 3 of the COP negotiations. At the end of these talks, we want a new collective quantified goal on finance. Developing countries want that. That's the title of our event today. Developing countries want that to be in the trillions. I mean, you, along with Nicholas Stern, you basically wrote the report on this, right? You basically wrote how much money is needed, where that money should be going, how much needs to be from foreign sources. And I know when I was reading about this and looking you up beforehand, on your X profile, you actually have a Mandela quote. It's always impossible until it's done. How much do you think that's the case this time round? Are you optimistic about a good outcome, and what do you think that will look like?
I was sitting beside Avi. I'm always optimistic. No, thank you for having this conversation. I actually believe that it is possible, and I think we just came from an event where the Climate Policy Initiative was doing a report which says that, you know, from 2018 we were spending around $600 billion on sort of the climate space, and today we're at 1.5 trillion almost. Clearly nowhere near where we want to go, but the scale has just ratcheted up, and that gives me hope, because it essentially says, you know, it took us a while, and it's always sort of, it takes a while to get everybody, you know, it's always impossible until it's done. You know, it's that beginning is difficult to sort of get going, except you're sprinting, but this is a marathon. And so I think I am hopeful. I'm also hopeful because even if, you know, it's the big countries that we want to attack, you know, the lungs of Africa today are also sequestering carbon. And I think one of the things that happened on day 1 of the COP was that we made progress on Article 6. So we're getting closer to, you know, getting the right price for the right kind of sequestration of carbon that hopefully, you know, we get to a carbon market compliance, fully integrity filled carbon market that allows for many of these other countries that are able to, you know, if you can actually trade carbon today, we could actually electrify many countries. We could make sure that, you know, the 27 million women who go to bed, you know, with respiratory diseases and pass away can move to better cooking methods and things like that. So I am optimistic. We still say in our report $1 trillion. I think one of the things that, you know, the CPI numbers show us is that we're ratcheting up. The MDBs, the multilateral development banks, have not yet gotten the resources that they will need. Avi is here, and you know, the initiatives that are being launched at the Inter-American Development Bank, amazing initiatives. You know, the credit enhancement, we need those resources, because even in the bigger countries, we're going to be able to buy down, we must be able to buy down the cost of investment for us to get to where we want to get to. The last reason why I'm really optimistic is if you look at what China has been doing, just amazing stuff, right? Yes, they still have coal plants that they need to retire, but they've brought down the price of solar panels from 44 cents to 4 cents. So literally one of these days it'll be 1 cent, and all of us will be able to afford it, and we can sort of move to cleaner technologies. So I think the technology boost, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, has sort of unleashed innovation on battery energy storage in the United States as we've never seen before in the last 2.5 years. So I'm optimistic. I hope that the innovation is happening. The resources are there, we know for sure. Now the resources need to go to the right places, and that's where we still need a big struggle.
And the negotiations are at a very fragile state. I mean, at one level, it all could unravel. We don't get an agreement. The number could be not enough. But another level, I think that we are seeing an emerging framework. So the problem with the 100 billion was that it became an irrelevant number.
Right.
So now they're talking about two numbers. That there may be an outer number, which borrows from Vera and Nick Stern's report, which says that the cross-border financing need is about 1.1 to 1.3 trillion. So you may see an outer number which says that there needs to be $1.3 trillion per year. But then there's a smaller number because, I mean, governments aren't getting elected to raise, double, and treble aid budgets. Aid budgets are 200 billion. You're saying we need 1.3 trillion, 5 times, 6 times more. So there's a smaller number, which is public finance. So there'll be 1.3 trillion, which all kinds of finance, including the private sector, but a public finance number that developed countries will lead on that may be in the order of $300 billion. And as Vera was saying, the MDBs today are probably going to do about 120 billion by 2030. So with additional resources, they may be able to make a big contribution to get towards the 300 billion figure.
Mm. It's interesting you mentioned that 300 billion figure because I was at an event yesterday on the Global Solidarity Levies Task Force. Vera, I know you're closely involved with that. And one of the speakers is your good friend, Barbados Prime Minister Motley. And some of the numbers that she's talking about there are quite staggering, really. I mean, the financial transactions tax, I mean, you're talking about over $400 billion there. Aviation tax on business flights, I mean, you're talking about 80 billion, a similar amount when it comes to on the maritime sector. Vera, can you just talk about the appetite for these new innovative instruments? Are we at a tipping point where we are going to be thinking about this more and more, and do you think countries will agree to that?
No, I think, thank you. So the financial transactions tax, I think the numbers come up to about $481 billion of taxation. I think the big tension there is around, if you start taxing financial transactions, and we've all been following recent events, capital gains, are you going to realize gains taxation or not? It can move elections. And then the issue then is, when you tax that, what is the distribution process around which you do that? But my sense is that as we begin to, Valencia, Barcelona, North Carolina, Florida, these are all happening in close, developed country neighborhoods. Used to be, the conversation was, well, Samoa, Cameroon, Barbados are going to sink. But now it's happening, it's a global common. And I think that what is happening in the maritime sector is a very good example, because the maritime sector is doing two things. They've come together to change their maritime fuels, but they're also actually seriously discussing a tax amongst themselves. So I think there is recognition that we will need at some point. Avi and I are economists, and we have something called the Pigouvian tax, which says, if there's a negative externality, you put a cost to it and somebody has to pay out. I think one of the things that has happened is we have managed to convince ourselves that we could produce this externality without cost. And the time has come now where we must realize what those costs are, and we must start charging appropriately so that, again, like I said, we know we're beginning to have the technologies to make sure that we don't hit 1.5. What we need is two things. We need those resources, but we also need that the technology be socialized. It's not enough that battery energy storage happens in the United States and does not happen in Egypt, for example, that is also producing steel. I think we do need to make sure that Egypt, Indonesia, Vietnam, the large countries, middle-income countries, have access to this technology as well. Otherwise, we will not reach those targets. So,
I think the way to do it is, firstly, let's limit what we're going to use taxes for. Let us fund things that can't be funded any other way. Loss and damage is a good example of that. Right. Then let's focus on those things that already exist. It's almost a bit of a conspiracy. People don't realize how many forms of tax around carbon and energy actually exist. I wonder how many Americans know there's an oil spill fund in America. 9 cents of every barrel produced in America and imported into America goes into the oil spill fund. It has $8 billion today. If we spread that across coal and gas and made that globally, you will fund all loss and damage.
That's super interesting. I mean, you're talking about a relatively small amount here, right? I guess it has to be relatively small so people kind of don't notice it. I mean, we're seeing a pushback in Brussels where I work. You're seeing a kind of pushback against various different climate measures. But if it's small enough, it can actually mobilize.
I think there's a famous French Treasury minister who said the art of taxation is to pluck the duck with the least amount of hissing. So it's a very small taxes over a very large quantity.
I forgot to mention at the start, but if you do have any questions, there was a QR code up there earlier. I'm sure you've seen it earlier today, and we'd be happy to take some questions there. Avinash, I know you're going to be closely involved in the G20, which kicks off next week, later this week, next week. One of the ideas put forward by Brazil, which is the president of the G20 currently, they want to see possibly a billionaires tax, a wealth tax on around 3,000 billionaires, I think it would be. Can you talk to me about that? And is it a good way, or is it just kind of a kind of catchphrase almost that won't raise that much?
Well, these things are deeply political, but we do need a shift, a mindset shift, that we have critical, existentialist, global public issues like climate change, and we can't, there's a lot we can do by being more efficient, by using multilateral development banks more, but there's a point where you run out of options of doing more without anything else. So we're going to need some additional resources. That's why it's great that Laurence and others, and Vera is working on the global solidarity levies. That will be the example of one of those solidarity levies. You've got to think deeply about the politics, though. So if you want to tax something and then take the revenues and spend them somewhere else, that's deeply politically challenging. So you need to find a way of saying, well, you're going to get half the revenues. The country will get half the revenues, and half maybe goes internationally. So we need to think about not so much what we tax, because many of these ideas are now quite common: financial transactions, carbon, emissions, oil, billionaires. The question is, let's come up with some tax design that makes it efficient and workable.
Vera, I mean, in your introductory remarks there, you mentioned China, you mentioned the speed of their transition, how they're manufacturing many of the solar panels that are used elsewhere in the world. There's a lot of focus on China, I think, at this year's COP, not least because what we've seen in the US and the election there. But even before that, I mean, developed countries were saying, look, China needs to contribute. China needs to step up and start paying in a public finance, or at the very least, just being transparent about what it already does do. What's your take on that?
I think two things. The first is China is doing a lot internally. We've seen even in the electric vehicle field, China is probably going to become, by the end of this year, the sort of largest consumer producer of electric vehicles. They will be number one. But that also means that you can come to Baku and drive an electric car which is cost affordable and efficient, because the technology and the cost of that technology is now affordable, right? And I think China is to electric vehicles and solar panels a little bit what Indonesia was to the LED bulb. It was a decision from the government of Indonesia to say that all government buildings, houses, will move to LED bulbs. And the global price of LED bulbs collapsed. And so then everybody else could do that. And I think these are the kinds of sort of tipping points that we need in the climate debate. I think China this time, for the first time on Monday, announced its numbers in terms of what they have been doing. I think it was 10 billion, 3.1 billion a year that they were putting into climate transition finance. They still need to do more. They need to do on tide. We are now raising the international IDA, the sort of fund for the World Bank's fund for the poorest, as well as the African Development Bank fund. And we would like, China to contribute a lot more, do a lot more in terms of how they contribute to that. Of course, the minute you say contributions, we get into a much, much more difficult and thorny conversation, which is around voice and shares and voting rights and things like that. And I think it's not so much that China is not contributing, it's a little bit around this global financial architecture conversation then that we sort of, get to where it becomes a little bit more difficult in the conversation. But I think two things that the MDBs have done and done well is they've created, hybrid capital buckets where you can put resources towards climate change in the multilateral development system without sort of having the conversations on access and voice. But at some point, that's why we talk about the just energy transition. At some point, we're going to have those conversations around, as we said, 80% of the sort of greenhouse gas emissions are produced by the G20 countries. And so at some point, we have to say to ourselves, are they going to sort of, contribute to 80% of the financing of that? China is included, by the way, in that 20 countries that emit 80% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So I think this is where the conversation becomes even more important, because the middle-income countries are now, in the next 5 years, will become much, much higher polluters. And the argument is, we have to be able to convince them that you can actually grow, you can create more jobs, you can deliver more prosperity in the transition. But one of the things that we are seeing today is that in the financial sector, people are going from, don't fund the brown, let's just fund the green, let's just fund the blue. But you must fund the transition, because countries need to go from the brown to the green in a non-disruptive fashion. If they go in a disruptive fashion, it creates all kinds of cost on the economy, inefficiencies that it delivers. And I always use the case of the United Kingdom, which has taken this long, until 2 or 3 weeks ago, to close its last coal plant. If it took 40 years for the UK to close its coal plant, imagine South Africa, imagine Vietnam, imagine what they will need. And we need to finance those coal plants that are still going now, so that as we take them out of production, they stay as efficient as they can be, so that these economies continue to grow. And I think that's where the tensions are. And I think as China begins to produce some numbers that they've done now, hopefully the China climate representative just yesterday again said that they were willing to sort of have more constructive discussions around what more they could do and how they could do it. So again, another area for optimism, I think, as we go forward.
I think the thing about China, it is doing more in installed capacity on solar and wind and hydro that all other countries put together. All other countries put together. The fact that we should be somehow blaming them and criticizing them and pushing them, I think is crazy. The rest of the world should be doing what they're doing. And what they've done with solar and collapsing the price of solar has made it possible, as Vera was saying, for all other developing countries to pursue this route. And so I think that that's not the problem we need to solve. There's some other countries that are not doing it fast enough and are about to have an explosion in demand. And we've got to find ways of making that transformation, convincing them that they need to make a transformation that is bigger and faster than all rich countries did themselves.
We are out of time. I just want to ask you very, very briefly to get your crystal balls out and say what you expect to happen over the next few days. What do you see as the key hurdles? How are parties to the COP going to overcome them? And where do you think we'll be in 2 weeks' time? Avinash.
I think there's a 50.1% chance that we will get a deal, that it's going to have a headline number that developing countries need $1.3 trillion per year, and that developed countries will take the lead in providing $300 billion of public finance.
That's the benchmark, $300 billion, what to look out for. Vera?
2 things. One, the International Development Association contributions for either, I think we must have a headline that says $100 billion is going to the lowest income countries to help them with the transition. They cannot continue to amass debt for climate change.
Brilliant. Well, we're very lucky to have 2 of the biggest and best names in the game, so if you could show your appreciation with a round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much for joining us today for Bloomberg Green at COP. It was so nice to have you here. I'd like to thank all of our amazing speakers and moderators and all of you for being such a great audience this afternoon. We really appreciate you joining us. To continue following all of our formidable Bloomberg Green reporters that are here on the ground this week, you can visit bloomberg.com/green. And all of our content is free this week, so you can view all of it and keep up with all of the reporting that is happening with all the amazing reporters that you saw on the stage today. And we also have a reception that's happening right outside of this room now, so please feel free to join us. We also have an additional reception happening from 6 to 9 upstairs that you are also welcome to join after the one we have down here. So thanks again for joining us, and we will see you next time. Thank you.